Ladies and gentlemen, you're all very welcome this morning to the Health and Safety Authority National Summit on the Future of Workers and Work. And we have an excellent lineup of speakers this morning. We will also have an opportunity for a couple of panel discussions with questions and answers from the floor. But just first of all, I want to draw your attention to a few safety issues. The first one is that there are no fire drills this morning, so if you do hear an alarm going off, it is the real thing, and please make your way to the nearest exit. There's an exit down here on this side, on the left, there's one down here on the right, and you'll see at the back of the room on either side there are fire exits there as well. Just take a note of those. In relation to your phones, if you could put them on silent, that would be great, because we actually want you to use your phones, because we'll be using the Slido app in a short while and during a number of occasions in this morning's session. But the whole question of work and future of work and health and safety and everything, we're going to hear a lot today about automation, about digitization, about remote working, about subcontracting and types of work. But I'm reminded of when I was a student in the 1980s, I got a summer job in a factory in Germany. It was a fruit canning factory, and they used to hire about 100 students from Ireland for the summer. And there was one guy who was an engineering student, and his summer job was they had a little kink in their production line whereby as the jars of fruit would come around the corner, sometimes they would tip over and crash and fall. And his job the whole summer was to stand there, and as each little tray of jars would come around, he would turn them around the bend, just like that. And after about 2 weeks, it started to drive him around the bend. So he went off and he got a metal bar. And he placed the metal bar strategically right on the bend so that when the next box of jars came around, it touched the bar and it turned around the corner himself. And he went over to the foreman and he said, "There you go. You need to find me a new job. You don't need me to be here at all." And the foreman said, "From now on, your job is to watch that metal bar and make sure it doesn't fall off." So I want to invite you to have a look at this at slido.com, because we're going to use it as a tool really to poll some of your views about certain topics, and I'll return to it during the discussions as well. So if you go to slido.com, the password is HSA Summit. It's not case sensitive, don't worry about that. And you don't need to put in the hashtag, because I think Slido already provide that. So just HSA Summit. And if you could do it now, I just have a couple of questions. It'll be interesting to get the ball rolling as to what your views are. So question one is, you're all in. How concerned are you about the occupational safety and health challenges for workers and workplaces of the future? Are you not at all concerned, somewhat concerned, or very concerned? So if you want to just make a selection, we'll see it coming in. Very concerned seems to be leading the pack. Somewhat concerned is leading the pack, and then we have very concerned, and a small percentage are not at all concerned. So we're looking at over 71% there saying that they're somewhat concerned about it. We have a second question. My senior management team understand occupational safety and health challenges and give these due consideration as part of our overall risk management framework. Would you strongly agree, disagree, or strongly disagree? And we can see there, strongly agree. Agree is in the lead with over 50% there, 59. Strongly agree is 33. So that would seem to reflect that you're reasonably comfortable with the level of understanding that people have in the organizations, which I'm sure is a very positive thing. So thank you very much for that, and we'll close off that poll, and we'll come back to a few other questions during the discussion sessions later on. We'll also have a coffee break between the first and second panel discussions. So I'm delighted to welcome and introduce to you the Chief Executive Officer of the Health and Safety Authority, Dr. Sharon Mcginnis. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Excuse me, my voice is a little bit croaky, but hopefully I'll manage. Thank you very much, Richard, and good morning, ladies, gentlemen, speakers and colleagues. I'm delighted to welcome you to the Health and Safety Authority Summit on the future of workers and work. This summit has been held in conjunction with the Government's Future Jobs Ireland framework, which is for the development of Ireland's economy in the midterm. And we all know that work is good for us, good for our health and our well-being. And it's a central plank of the Future Jobs event to ensure that our future economy is based around embracing quality and sustainable opportunities while promoting innovation and technology change. Something that we in the authority are also committed to in our promotion of health and regulation of health and safety in the workplace. We're actually celebrating our 30th anniversary this year, having been established in 1989. Our 1989 remit covered health and safety in a select number of sectors and workplaces, for example, construction. And we were getting ready to bring on board many of the other sectors that we're now very actively involved with, whether that was agriculture, healthcare, etc. Back then, just 37% of the population were working, and many of the laws and regulations which now shape the way we work every day were not yet in existence. Fast forward 30 years to 2019, much has changed for yourselves, but also for the authority. Our mandate has greatly expanded to include not just occupational health and safety in all workplaces, but also for those who are self-employed. A huge body of legislation has also been developed, and most of it derived obviously from the European Union, and further legislation is always on an ongoing basis as we regularise and modernise our legislation. We regulate the manufacture, use and import of chemicals to companies and right through to consumers. And we have a role in ensuring that goods and services that are used by companies and the public are safe and in compliance, as well as providing the National Accreditation Service in Ireland through the Irish National Accreditation Board. More importantly, the nature of work and workers' expectations have changed. We now have 4.8 million people in the state, with about 48% of those as workers. Inspection and investigation remains a core part of our overall strategy and remit. However, we have greatly increased our emphasis on preventing injuries and ill health through education, employers and employees about their duties and obligations. And if you haven't seen them already, we have lots of information outside around some of these tools and advice that we offer to employers and employees alike, and I would encourage you to go out and check them during the breaks. In the last number of years, we also have seen greater emphasis on workplace health, including exposure to physical, chemical, biological and psychosocial risks. In this time, there has been an increased focus on workplace well-being too, which, although not a direct requirement under health and safety legislation, has brought benefits to workers' health both in and out of the workplace. We have worked closely with Healthy Ireland on the development and promotion of well-being strategies, as we recognise that having a healthy worker in general brings benefits to workplace health and safety too. More importantly, since 1989, we now have a greater appreciation of the economic benefits and impacts from not protecting workers' health and safety. Occupational injuries and illness impose not just significant burdens on those individuals and their families, but also on employers, the economy and society as well. The most extreme consequences of work-related injuries and illness involve cases where workers or members of the public lose their life. Work-related accidents continue to claim lives, and already this year we have 41 people who have been fatally injured while going about their working life. These workers and their families pay the ultimate price for unsafe working conditions or practices. And then, of course, there's the toll of ill health and injury. In 2017, the CSO reported that there were about 900,000 working days lost due to an occupational injury, and a further 1 million plus lost due to work-related illness. The costs for society and the economy not only include lost productivity, but also include the compensation schemes for those affected workers. But we mustn't remember that at the heart of all these economic facts lies workers whose lives have been cut short through a fatal accident, or who can no longer enjoy a good working life due to an illness or injury. All of us know someone who has been affected from an occupational injury or illness. And as we look forward to the future, we need to make sure that the numbers of workers affected by work-related risks do not increase. So as things stand, it might seem difficult to predict what 2049 is going to look like, given the rapid pace of change we're currently observing. But we already know from history that industrialisation brought with it enormous upheavals in terms of economy and society, as well as concerns about the health and safety and well-being of workers. We are now facing Industry 4.0 and rapid digitalisation, which will bring further upheavals to economies and societies. However, with the knowledge that we have gained on preventing occupational health and safety risks, with changes brought through industrialisation so far, we should be able to embrace all these new ways of working without affecting the ability of all of us to work in a healthy and safe environment. And as we look forward, we ask ourselves what the new workplaces of the future are going to look like for workers, and indeed, what will the worker of the future face? The current rapid changes within the labour market, including digitalisation and increased use of artificial intelligence, can bring positive opportunities and potential for improving conditions. We will likely have less physical work as more and more workplaces replace particular work tasks with robotics or artificial intelligence. This obviously brings with it health and safety benefits, as manual work is often where we see most fatalities and accidents occurring, for example in construction, agricultural, etc. In addition, physically demanding work also has health implications and may affect our workers' ability to extend their working life. We're going to see more services coming on stream that will once the preserve of institutions and individuals. How many of us now rely on our evening meal to be delivered, our taxi to arrive at the press of a button, or our elderly parents to be looked after in their homes by home care providers? Traditional notions of what a workplace is also changing. Many workplaces only exist in the digital world, and notions of the employer-employee relationship can be difficult to define. This increase in diversification of workplaces and work through atypical working hours, subcontracting, work on demand, etc., raises challenges not just for the individual worker, but also for regulators and those who are charged with regulating employer duties and protecting workers' rights. More green jobs will be created as society and governments move to address climate change. We are already starting to see traditional sectors, for example, construction, move towards green activities such as retrofitting buildings for energy conservation, as well as the development of new green areas of work such as recycling, renewable energy production, sustainable agriculture, etc. While this change will see traditional high-risk sectors decline, we need to be mindful that not all green jobs or technologies will necessarily be healthy or safe for the workers involved in the transition to a low-carbon economy. For example, there is increased risk right now of exposure to the known carcinogen asbestos for workers who are involved in retrofitting old buildings. Worker demographics will also change. By 2031, it is forecast that at least 32% of the labour force will be aged over 50 years. This rise is predicted on the basis of a global increase in the population of this age group, but also an increase in the labour force participation of those aged 50. Social and economic factors and policies at a national level are also promoting the extension of working life. More women are being encouraged into the workforce so that society can benefit from this wider talent pool. We know that women tend to work in different sectors as well as potentially take different tasks within those sectors, with the resulting conditions and risks that they experience different to those experienced by men. People will have multiple jobs in the course of their careers, which can bring benefits obviously, but can also cause gaps in how an individual's health and safety is managed, addressed and reported throughout their working life. We already know that for many of our children, the work they do or the professions they enter may not even be invented yet. More workers are being subjected to the gig economy, such as that's the labour market characterised by the prevalence of short-term contracts or freelance work, as opposed to permanent jobs. With this type of work, identifying who is responsible for the worker's health and safety will be more challenging, not only for the worker, but for regulators as well. There will be more lone workers employed, and by that I don't just mean those who work on their own physically, but who are also isolated in terms of connections to colleagues and employers, such as may happen in the gig economy. all the benefits of having defined employer and employee relations and links, whether for occupational health and safety or personal and industrial relations, could get lost. Which brings me to the topic of remote working, and specifically the option of working from home. We know this form of working brings benefits to employers and employees alike, and that in terms of retaining older staff and encouraging greater female participation, it is particularly important. In addition, as we move to a low-carbon economy, reducing the need for undue travel also brings benefits to the environment. However, irrespective of where your employee works, whether that is their kitchen table or their office cubicle, employers are still responsible and still need to take account of and address any occupational health and safety risks arising. So what does this all mean for occupational health and safety and the work of the authority as a regulator and your role as an employer? In the rush to embrace digitalisation, we should not forget that us humans are social beings and work and live best when connected. As we become increasingly digitally connected, but perhaps emotionally disconnected, this will impact not just on workers' health and safety, but also on the wider benefits that looking after workers' health and safety can bring to companies. We know psychosocial risks and work-related stress are some of the most challenging health concerns facing us today. Almost half of all workers in Europe consider that work-related stress is a common challenge in their workplace. In Ireland, a study from the SRI from 2018 found that job stress, which was co-funded with ourselves, found that job stress among employees in Ireland doubled from 8% in 2010 to 17% in 2015. Workers in Ireland were more likely to report the pressure of emotional demands and exposures to bullying, harassment and other forms of mistreatment, but less likely to report time pressure than their Western European counterparts. The report also found that women have a higher risk of stress, anxiety and illness. Workers aged 35 to 54 years are also more likely to experience these types of illnesses. And the risk for stress, anxiety and depression is highest for workers in the education sector, followed by those in health, public administration, transport and other services, which includes finance, information and communication. Employers should already be addressing psychosocial risks in your occupational risk assessments. With the way work has been organised and carried out in the future, all employers need to consider psychosocial hazards in their risk assessments for these new ways of working. The authority has a free online tool, Work Positive, which is demonstrated outside. So again, I would encourage you to go out and have a look at that. It allows you and provides you with an ability to develop your own psychosocial risk management process. In addition, exposure to repetitive movements, tiring and painful positions, as well as carrying or moving heavy loads, still rank among the most prevalent physical risks across Europe. In recent years, manual handling has become the most common cause of non-fatal injuries reported to the authority here, with almost 1/3 of all injuries coming in this area. The resulting musculoskeletal disorders or diseases, or MSDs, are the most prevalent type of work-related health problems. Another ESRI report co-funded with the authority from 2016 found that while there was no gender difference in the risk of MSD, there was an age difference, with workers 35 to 64 years having the highest risk of MSD and being 2.5 times more likely to experience that illness than workers under 25. So with the anticipated increase in workers over 50, again 32% by 2031, coupled with the increasing levels of workers using computers, smartphones, other devices, not just at their office desk, but also from their kitchen table or on the go as they work remotely, employers need to take account of risks arising from MSDs and design the work so to prevent these long-term health impacts arising. We know that as workers get older, they have reduced levels of injuries but increased levels of illness. Older workers are also more likely to experience a fatal injury. However, occupational health and safety legislation should not be used as an excuse for limiting work opportunities for older workers, or indeed those for disabilities. Nor should occupational health and safety legislation be a reason to prevent new ways of working. As part of the authority's commitment to Future Jobs Ireland, we will be providing guidance on these areas and advice to employers in the coming year. In recent times, we're also seeing more people working longer and often with more precarious hours, even as we see all these advances in technology. From studies we commissioned, again with the ESRI in 2016, we know that longer working hours are associated with a higher probability of both injury and illness. We also know that those working a short number of hours per week, less than 20, have the highest risk per hour worked. And highly variable working hours were also linked to higher risks of injury and illness. Long working hours and variable working hours are just not common among self-employed workers, where you presume you're going to be working more on your own initiative. But the self-employed don't differ from employees in the risk of non-fatal injury or illness. So it affects us all. We also recognise that lifelong education and skills development will be important in helping workers transition to these future workplaces. However, in promoting education and skills development, we need to be mindful that there are skills that cannot be addressed through traditional, perhaps, education routes. With the anticipated increase in workers transitioning between roles in the future, educating and informing workers about addressing their health and safety risks is vital now, so they, together with their employers, can prevent any risks arising in the future. We have invested heavily in educating the workers of the future as well as current workers through tools such as e-learning, Be Smart, etc., and we will continue to do so. In addition, schemes such as SafePass, which have been used to advance health and safety in the construction sector over the past number of years, has been an important factor in making this sector safer and more profitable in the long run. Such schemes will certainly need to be maintained and indeed potentially expanded into new areas in the future. Finally, as a regulator, we also face challenges and opportunities. In general, regulations can often play a game of catch-up in addressing emerging trends. Our current health and safety legislation, the Safety, Health and Welfare at Work Act 2005, is almost 15 years old. And while it has and is serving us well, addressing the health and safety requirements for future workplaces will mean new legal challenges. Many of the hazards and risks anticipated in these new places of work require a different level of assessment and evidence to identify and address. And as we speak, there may already be a new chemical or a new physical agent under development which will bring new risks for workers. The nature of the workplace and how we define it is also changing. Therefore, we have to keep up with technological advancements. But there are also opportunities. After 30 years of regulation and health and safety legislation, we are all more informed about workplace risks and more attuned to taking steps to prevent such risks, leading to impact. Progressive companies and their leaders recognise the benefits that a healthy and safe environment brings not just to the workers but also their business. Business leaders like you, who put the health and safety of their workers when planning their future strategies for the new ways of working, will be the ones who succeed in the end. And as you can see, there are a wide range of issues and areas for us all to consider and address, and I've only really given you a very quick snapshot of what we might be facing us all as employers, employees and regulators. Our speakers here today, each of whom brings their different organisational and individual perspectives on the health and safety benefits and challenges, and indeed the nature of future work, will, I am sure, expand on a lot of what I've said, and perhaps also bring some other challenges to the table. I encourage you to ask questions and share your experiences, and I look forward to hearing everyone's views in the course of the event and indeed in the future as we move along. Remember, the future of work does not need to come at the expense of anyone's health and safety. The authority is here to work with you to shape the healthy and safe workplaces of the future so that we can all benefit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mcginnis. We're going to move on to the first of the panel sessions, which deals with enabling economic growth by aligning OSH performance to productivity and profit. I'm going to call up each speaker who will give a brief presentation, and then at the end of it we'll have a panel discussion and it will be thrown open to the floor. So please have your questions ready and do participate fully in that. So our first speaker of the session is Margarita Lane. She's an economist in the OECD's Future of Work unit. She led the OECD's recent work exploring public policy responses to new forms of work across the OECD and EU. And her current projects focus on labour market regulation and collective bargaining in own account work and on the labour market transitions of platform workers. Will you please welcome Margarita Lane? Thank you.
Thank you very much to the organisers and to the HSA for the invitation to come and speak to you today about this very timely topic. As Richard said, I'm in the Future of Work unit at the OECD. We're generally focusing on the big trends impacting the labour market. And so today I'll bring you through some of the main trends that might have implications for health and safety. And then also, as Richard said, a lot of my work has been on these kind of new forms of work that we've been seeing recently. And so I'll also talk about how give you some examples of how some countries are responding to these new forms of work, in particular in relation to occupational safety and health. So when we talk about the future of work, oftentimes people want to talk about robots and automation. And I think this is for a good reason. We've seen worldwide an increase in robot use, which is expected to continue, as you can see on this graph here. In Ireland, I think the robot use is actually not particularly high relative to other European countries or Asian countries, for example. But I think it's worth keeping an eye on this trend, which is expected to continue. Then work by my OECD colleagues estimates that 14% of jobs could be or are likely to be automated, and 32% of them are likely to change significantly. And the Irish figures for this are very much in line. It's 16% of jobs likely to be automated, and we're really thinking about in the kind of next 10 to 20 years. And then 27% of them likely to change significantly. So robotization and automation, how could this potentially impact occupational safety and health? Well, I suppose if you're thinking about the replacement of jobs, to see the impact on occupational safety and health, you would want to know which jobs are going to be replaced. Are they, if they're potentially more dangerous jobs or ones associated with more fatalities or accidents, then you could actually see positive impacts on safety and health. And in the work done by my colleagues on automation, actually it's manufacturing and agriculture which are the most likely to be automated. And then in the service sector, it is occupations like postal and courier services, land transport, and these again do have a higher risk of injury. So I think there could be one element whereby safety and health can actually be improved. On the other hand, I think one thing that we haven't quite understood is how the man-machine interaction might work and what the impacts of that might be on occupational safety and health. Of course, machines can work at incredible speeds, and if you think about machines and humans working together, you can imagine the risk for health and safety. Machine maintenance and repair is, of course, not without risk. So I think there are questions here about, well, will the correct training be available? Is it possible to maybe embed safety procedures within how the machines operate? And then I think the psychosocial risk of replacing an environment that used to be filled with workers and had quite a social element to actually one which is more a bit more lonely with man and robot working together. There was a really interesting op-ed it was a fictional op-ed in the New York Times last month, and it imagined the first ever human-free Amazon fulfillment factory. And so this imagines in the next few years, Jeff Bezos will cut the ribbon of his new factory, and the media will be saying this is great because all of this manual lifting that's been done over the last few years, which has had risks, will be replaced. And there'll be benefits in terms of work safety. But actually, this op-ed goes on to say that, well, actually, that may not be the case. Is it actually, the reality is that this type of factory isn't in fact human-free. You still need technicians to repair the machines. You still need you still need programmers to fix the software. You still need pickers to step in when the machines get jammed. It imagines a system where if there's an issue in the factory, an automated ticket is then sent to a contracting company, and then individual bidders or individual workers then bid for the work. What are the dangers imagined in this situation? Well, there's no aircon because, robots don't need it. So when humans are there, it's quite uncomfortable. You could have robots colliding with humans. And then in this imagined future, all of the management is done by text with an off-site supervisor. So you're missing that human element as well. And the piece finishes by saying that by selling the idea that my co-workers and I have all been replaced by robots, Amazon has rendered us invisible and placed us in peril. So when we talk about robots and automation, the question often posed is, well, should we brace for a jobless future? And I gave you previously the estimates of the jobs that would be significantly impacted by automation, but actually that doesn't include the creation of jobs. And also we've seen that employment rates have actually risen over the last 20 years. So I think overall we don't expect massive technological unemployment. What we expect instead is, in many cases, difficult transitions. And one of these big transitions is the push or the shift towards the service economy. And in general, over the last 20 years, most advanced economies have actually seen a shift from manufacturing to services, and this has also been the case in Ireland, where also there's been a contraction in the construction industry, which has been significant. So why does this happen, and why might it continue? Well, it's facilitated by automation and technological progress, which has really led to productivity growth in manufacturing. Then service industries tries to absorb a greater number of workers to keep output rising in line with manufacturing. What are the implications for occupational safety and health? Well, I think this is something that Sharon outlined very well. And it was encouraging, so where you might associate manufacturing jobs with more, and construction with more physical injuries, and you would think of these maybe as more hazardous. At the same time, there's actually been a lot of advancement in occupational safety and health regulation in these areas in the last few years. And it was quite encouraging to hear a kind of renewed focus on workplace well-being and workplace health, because these are going to continue to be very important and are going to be quite important in service industries, which, for example, they're in health and in social work. There are concerns about work-related illnesses, for example. Also, a new focus on psychosocial work challenges is also to be encouraged. The other big trend that might have an impact on occupational safety and health is the idea of the fissured workplace. This is really how the forms of work are changing, or how the work is carried out is changing. This term, the fissured workplace, came from a book by David Weil in 2014, and it's really all about domestic outsourcing. So whereas previously some work that's kind of outside of a company's core business might have been carried out by employees of that company, increasingly actually it's being outsourced to potentially contractors, to temp agencies, or to franchisees, for example, or it could even be to platform workers as well. And we see this, these are just two examples I've put up on screen of janitors and guards, where we've seen, there's no Irish figures here, but on average across the OECD, the share of guards that are outsourced has increased from about 13% in 13% to 25% over the last 20 years, and quite similar for janitors as well. And this is something that's facilitated in many cases by technology. So what are the potential implications of this for safety and health? Well, first of all, I think it's important to mention the implications for general working conditions. And actually, we see that wages for outsourced workers can be about 10 to 15% lower than the equivalent employees. So we do see actually a difference in the way these people are treated in terms of wages. So I think it is also possible that we would see a difference in how these people in the risk of occupational safety and health also. What are the risks? So first of all, I said that some of these people are self-employed contractors. Well, we know already that self-employed individuals are generally responsible for their own safety and health. They're also, if you don't have an employment contract, in most countries you don't have the standard protection against, for example, discrimination or sexual harassment. Then you could imagine that temp workers or even on-site contractors, they're coming new to a new work environment very often, and so they're adapting to their new workplace. I think there's also kind of a chain of or a dilution of the chain of responsibility as well. For example, for a technology company or for a social media platform that's outsourcing, for example, content moderation jobs to another service operator, there's a kind of dilution of responsibility in the care for these workers, at least as far as the large social media company is concerned. And then I think one of the jobs and Sharon also talked about the gig economy. I think this is somewhat linked, but what are the characteristics of the gig economy that potentially make it quite relevant for this discussion about occupational safety and health? Well, there's extremely high levels of competition between the workers. This means they may be unlikely to want to negotiate with the person offering the gig. There's kind of an imbalance of bargaining power. There's this excessive performance monitoring, which can have a psychosocial risk as well. Many of the platform jobs are in transportation industries. There's the kind of ad hoc nature of them. You have this inability perhaps to prepare for a new working environment. So I think this is platform work is a small chunk of the labour market, but it is growing. And I think it's interesting to think about how some of these characteristics could potentially become larger features of our work more generally and of standard work more generally. So talking about contracted work or own account workers, temp work, even variable hour contracts and platform work, well, these were some of the new forms of work that were explored in a piece of work that I did last year. This was a joint piece of work between the OECD and the EU, and we surveyed 44 countries around the world, and we asked them, how are you responding to new forms of work? We asked ministries of labour generally and other ministries as well. So this survey covered many, many areas. It covered skills, it covered regulation, it covered collective bargaining, and you can imagine that all of these topics have relevance for this discussion as well. What I'll just focus on today is giving you some examples of some of the measures planned or recently put in place or planned to be put in place in relation to occupational safety and health and in relation to actually more general working conditions. So in terms of occupational safety and health, for example, in France recently, there has been a rule that if you're a platform worker earning more than around €5,000 per year, if you invest or if you decide to cover yourself with occupational accident insurance, your platform now has to reimburse you for that. In Lithuania, they've brought in rules where even if you're a temp agency worker, even if you've been trained at the agency for a kind of general type of job, you still actually have to be trained at each workstation before you can start work at that workstation. And then in Korea, there's been a gradual expansion of industrial accident insurance to dependent contractors. Then thinking about general working conditions, really the message here is that yes, flexibility is needed in the labour market. However, growth in casual work shouldn't be driven by a firm's desire to circumvent labour market regulation. And so, and I think I just picked the ones that are most relevant here. But in Finland, as of I think 2 years ago, variable hour contracts can only be used where that need can be justified. So the employer has to have a variable need for labour if they want to use variable labour. In Japan, for example, there's been a push to eliminate irrational inequalities in working conditions for fixed-term workers. Essentially, by regulating the use of these more casual forms of employment, you are trying to avoid the case where firms are trying to evade their responsibilities, which would include those relating to safety and health. So those are some of the main themes that I think have relevance for occupational safety and health. And I hope the examples have been interesting to you. And I'm out of time, so feel free to ask me more about the examples in the panel later. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Margarita. Our next speaker is Joakim Pintado Nunez. He's the acting chief of the Lab Admin OSH branch of the Governance and Tripartism Department of the International Labour Organization. And he's been the team lead on labour administration and labour inspection since 2014. Will you please welcome Joakim Pintado Nunez? Thank you.
So good morning, dear ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I'd like to thank the kind invitation from the Health and Safety Authority to be here, representing the ILO. So as the topic for this summit is on the future of work, I thought that most interesting for you would be to bring you some words on what the ILO is preparing in terms of occupational safety and health, and how will this affect, member states, workers and businesses. So, starting by showing you, a report that we developed for this year's Safe Day. So, the Safe Day campaign, as you may know, it's a global campaign on occupational safety and health that we have since 2003. So, every year we select a topic. The topic for this year, as the ILO was celebrating its centenary, we decided that the most relevant would be exactly to look into the past 100 years of existence of the organization and to see how occupational safety and health has evolved over the century, but also looking into the future and the new challenges that the future will bring in terms of safety and health at work. So the report is available online in many different languages and, of course, in English. And together with the report, we have 33 think pieces of academia and researchers from different regions and countries looking into new challenges in the world of work, namely new forms of work, technology, climate change, etc. So the report is structured into three parts. The first part looks into the past, so it really looks into the milestones of the ILO when it comes to occupational safety and health. Namely, when the ILO started its program of development cooperation on the topic in 1970, also the landmark convention, I would say, that influenced so much, all national legislations, including in the EU and including the EU framework on occupational safety and health. And I'm referring, of course, you can mention number 155 from 1981. And also, as it will be the case on the recent declaration on the future of work that has included OSH as a priority for years to come in the organization. But I'll be referring to that in a couple of minutes. So in part two, we look into the challenges on safety and health at work ahead of us, and challenges dealing with technology and robotics, automation, nanotechnologies, also the challenges related to societal change and demographics, so young workers, aging workers, migrant workers, vulnerable groups of workers, such as, let's say, access of women to the labor market in many parts of the world with very specific characteristics, also to sustainable development and effects climate change, on us, both for enterprises, but also in terms of leading, national responses to address these new challenges, and as well new forms of work. And of course, we have their platform work and all that it comes with platform work, namely in terms of psychosocial hazards. The part 3 of the report looks into, let's say, some hints on how our tripartite constituents may address these new challenges. And when I refer to tripartite constituents, of course, I'm referring to governments, workers, and employers' organizations. And this, in summarizing very much, leads us to conclude that, our constituents, would need to put in place responses that are very much based on anticipating the risks, having a multidisciplinary approach to occupational safety and health, and also, and very important here, also to, let's say, make the bridge or improving the bridge between occupational health and public health, which is still a major challenge in many countries. So in terms of novelty, I would say that, well, these are the latest estimates we have on occupational diseases and injuries around the world. As you may know, we present these estimates every time we have our World Congress, so every 3 years. These ones are from 2017, from our World Congress in Singapore. And I'd just like to say to you that although these are estimates, and we are working now together with the World Health Organization to develop a new methodology to estimate the burden of disease, that I would say is more accurate, and that will bring us, new figures on the scale of the problem at national level, but also regional and country level. We can see, again, even with estimates, that the priority for the organization and for the majority of countries will have to be on occupational disease, as occupational disease represents around 86% of fatalities related to work in all the world, and when we speak of occupational disease, of course we have, the so-called, traditional diseases, related to exposure to, hazardous substances, to, MSTs, etc., but also all that comes, in terms, nowadays, in terms of exposure to, new technologies, and also in the mental health issues. So the new methodology being developed with the World Health Organization will be, let's say, the estimates will be available next year, and we'll be able to present this to you when organizing our next World Congress, the 22nd World Congress on Occupational Safety and Health, being held in Toronto, Canada, from the 4th to the 7th of October next year. And I leave here the invitation for all of you to be there and attend it. So I would say that, in terms of this session, for me, the most important would really be, to let you know on, what the ILO is preparing on occupational safety and health. And, together with the declaration, the Centenary Declaration for the Future of Work, that recognizes OSH as being fundamental for decent work, and that also recognizes that every single worker, should be entitled to safe and healthy working conditions, independently of the type of employment relationship, and including for workers in the informal economy in all types of countries, developed, in developing countries, etc. The declaration comes together with a resolution that invites the office to look for ways to declare occupational safety and health within the framework of what we call the fundamental principles and rights at work. Well, it's not yet clear if this will happen. This will depend very much on the voice and decision of our tripartite constituents. But if it happens, this will be a major change for many countries. Not necessarily for Ireland, because you have ratified the most relevant conventions on occupational safety and health, but for all the countries that did not ratify these conventions. Because according to what we call, the 1998 Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work, by the single fact of member states being members of the organization, they are obliged to apply in practice the elements of what we call our 4 core fundamental rights at work. And these are elimination of child labor, freedom of association and collective bargaining, elimination of forced labor and non-discrimination. So this would mean that the conventions or the standards that would be recognized as being fundamental standards would be directly applicable to member states independently of ratification. So you may see what kind of change this could have at a global scale. So also when looking into the landscape ahead of us, the ILO has been looking into, well, there is a tripartite group of experts that has been looking into our normative framework. So as you know, the ILO started in 1919. We have some conventions and recommendations which are I would say a bit old now. And this group of experts is looking into all of these standards and seeing to what extent they are still updated or outdated, if they should be withdrawn, but also identifying needs for new standards to be developed. So the group looked into the OSH standards back in 2017, and it was decided that there was work to be done in terms of developing new technical guidelines. And these new technical guidelines will complement the conventions we have on these issues, or will be guidelines for topics for which we do not have conventions. The technical guidelines will be on chemical hazards, on ergonomics, and on biological hazards. So this is work that has already started, and it will be available before 2024. And this will provide guidance to all of our member states, employers, governments, employers, workers, and governments on how to address these different types of hazards. Also, in terms of normative work, it was decided that there were some topics for which we do have standards, conventions, but that these conventions need to be complemented or updated. So there was a decision that the office will be working also on new standards related to chemical hazards, to biological hazards, to ergonomics, and to safety of machinery. So the dates are not yet established, but this will be worked for years to come. In terms of assistance provided by the office to countries, but also in terms of research, priorities were as well identified. And these priorities are within what we call our global flagship program for safety and health at work, called Safety and Health for All. And basically, the priorities are focused on different business models, groups of workers, and also specific hazards. So the business models are small and micro-sized small and micro enterprises, global supply chains, and for global supply chains, there is a multi-donor fund called the Vision Zero Fund, which is addressing particularly, the OSH challenges, in supply chains in two sectors, garment and agriculture. And together with these sectors, for the global flagship, we also have, one of the most hazardous sectors, as you all know, construction. Then in terms of vulnerable groups of workers, the program is focusing very much on youth, women, and migrant workers. So in terms also of, the landscape, out there and, changes in years to come, I would like to announce that just recently, this year, on the 12th of November, a global coalition for occupational safety and health was launched. So this global coalition, you may ask yourselves, why, another global alliance, another global coalition, why do we have a need, is there a need for this? Yes, there is a need for this because this is the first ever global alliance on safety and health at work. And this, is intended to be a convener of all the different regional initiatives, national initiatives on occupational safety and health, and to bring safety and health at work to the forefront of political agendas, but also very much to look into the knowledge that is being developed out there, the very good knowledge being developed by the HAC, the very good knowledge being developed by different organizations at the European Union level, for instance, by the Asian OSHNet, etc., and bring all of this knowledge together and create a platform where this knowledge can be shared between countries and between organizations. And this will be the work of task groups. So these task groups are, let's say, some of them, the topics were already decided, but the task groups are open to any organization with a mandate on occupational safety and health. So the task groups, of course, are open to governments, to regional organizations, to national organizations, to civil society organizations, provided that they work on occupational safety and health. So the governance structure of the coalition is very simple. There is a steering committee, and I would like to emphasize that the steering committee is represented by organizations, countries, and social partners, as it should be. And it couldn't be the contrary when you have the ILO being the chair of the steering committee and also having the secretariat for the coalition. As a milestone in the near future is the fact that when organizing our next World Congress in Toronto, Canada, as I said before, from the 4th to the 7th of October. On the 5th of October, we will have a high-level event where we will be inviting countries and organizations to sign a declaration of support to this global effort on occupational safety and health. And we do hope to have Ireland there. This declaration of support will be, a global call for action to, really increase the efforts of the global community of countries, of employers, of unions to really pay the attention that safety and health at work deserves from all of us. So this was in a nutshell what I wanted to share with you, in terms of the landscape looking ahead of us in terms of the work of the ILO, and I hope that was useful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joakim. Our next speaker is Jesus Alvarez Hidalgo. He is a policy advisor at the Health and Safety Unit of the European Commission, and he's in charge of the relations with the European Agency for Safety and Health at Work. And he also deals with the mental health and psychological risks at the workplace. Will you please welcome Jesus Alvarez Hidalgo? Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much to the organizers for inviting the European Commission here. It's an honor for me to be here. I will try to give you some European perspective in this very, very interesting topic you have chosen for the National Summit. And as you know very well, in the European Commission, we are somehow in a period of transition. Yesterday, the new European Commission was approved by the European Parliament by a large majority. And it is maybe important to recall that the previous European Commission, the Juncker Commission, has put also occupational safety and health very, very high in the political agenda. I will refer a little bit later on. What are now the perspectives? It seems that the perspectives at European level are rather positive. The new president of the Commission, Mrs. van der Leyen, in the European Parliament referred very clearly in his political declaration in the guidelines that the EU social policy will remain in the heart of this present European Commission. In particular, she announced a very ambitious action plan to implement the European Pillar of Social Rights. The new Commissioner, Mr. Smith, in charge of jobs, also announced that he will give a very particular attention to occupational safety and health. And in this new challenge, in these new challenging perspectives, looking to the future of work, I know very well, I don't need to convince you about the benefits of investing in OSH, in occupational safety and health. We all know that paying attention and investing resources in protecting workers' health and safety pays off, is a good investment. We have a lot of studies that show that on top of preventing work-related diseases, occupational accidents, possible effects on workers' health and safety, investing in OSH also promotes quality promotes productivity, foster competitiveness. So it's a good deal, it's a good investment. But our policy makers, our decision makers in our respective organizations are asking more and more for constructing somehow the business case, the business model of investing in NOS. And fortunately, we have a very solid knowledge now and a lot of data. In general, the data we have indicate that for every euro, for each euro invested in NOS, there is a return of more than 2 euros, 2.2 in average, in terms of quality, productivity, competitiveness, reducing absenteeism, presenteeism as well. So this is part now of our culture in Europe. We have in the European Union a very well consolidated legislation. You know very well. We have the Framework Directive. We have more than 30 directives now, covering all sectors, all kinds of risks, physical, chemical, biological, etc. And we have the European Pillar of Social Rights, a specific principle covering the right of having a healthy, safe, and well-adapted working environment. And when we analyze the result, now is the 30th anniversary of the Framework Directive. It was adopted in 1989. So in these 30 years of constructing this very ambitious and very solid corpus of legislation, when we analyze the results, especially over the last years, we see a very positive results in general. For example, overall OSH in Europe is improving. The number of workers dying for accidents at work has dropped by almost a quarter since 2008. So in the last 10, 11 years. The number of workers in the EU reporting war-related health problems have dropped by around 10%. But this is not enough. We have still many challenges. When we look to the future of work, we will refer later on to that, we have to be aware that the past, the challenges of the past and the present are still there. For instance, the chemical substances, the carcinogens. That's why the European Commission has, over the last years, has promoted a very, very active and committed action against chemicals and in particular carcinogens at work, with the support of all the institutions and of course of the European Agency for Safety and Health at Work. And now it's necessary to combine this legislative and cultural progress that we have with looking ahead, because legislation is not enough. Legislation is very good. We have probably at EU level one of the most advanced legislation in the world, but we need to ensure that the legislation is properly applied and properly implemented, that it's well understood, and that we provide and facilitate the implementation, practical tools, information, awareness. In this respect, at EU level, for instance, the European Agency, the Bilbao Agency, is really instrumental in these aspects. They are the agencies promoting and providing a very big practical support to the EU policy objectives in this field. The SLIC also, the Senior Labour Inspectors Committee, is playing a very substantial role. It's important to mention also briefly that not only the Commission, the other EU institutions are really committed to WASH now. The Council of Ministers, the European Parliament. The Parliament has published very recently a very interesting resolution on employment and social policies, And this resolution is insisting in the fact that investment in OSH do not only improve job quality and well-being, but have also a positive effect on the productivity and competitiveness of the EU economy. Also, the European Social Committee, the European Economic and Social Committee, has very recently in September issued a very interesting opinion about the summary of the costs and benefits of investments in OSH. And well, the European Economic and Social Committee estimates around 3.3% of the GDP the losses that we have for not having a always sound health and safety conditions. So the challenge is huge. When we look to the future of work, our lives are changing, our society is changing very, very quickly. We see the new elements, we see the digitalization, the robotization, we see the artificial intelligence, the gig economy. Well, I try not to repeat the other speakers have very well analyzed the topics. The low carbon economy and the challenges in terms of not only of production systems but also on OSH. In this challenging context, we have the formation of seeing mainly risks and problems and challenges. But it is also true that there are many opportunities. There are wonderful opportunities in these new technologies, in these developments, but it's true that there are also important challenges when it comes to workers' health and safety. And in this perspective, we try to somehow anticipate, which is not easy at all. The Bilbao agency is doing a great job in this constructing the foresighted scenarios for anticipating the evolution and of these very, very important changes. But we have the impression that the speed of the advancement, the technical progress is somehow so overwhelming that it's not easy. It's not easy to follow and to really anticipate. And in this perspective, our reflections go now in the direction of the crucial importance of involving in a very, very practical way all the stakeholders, all the actors in the world of work, because this is not only the business of the authorities, as you know very well. This is also the matter of social partners, in particular. The tripartite structure that we have in Europe in this aspect is essential. We have to pay a lot of attention in this perspective of the future to young workers. Young workers are the future, and not only workers but also young employers in these startups that are being created. Finally, the attention to micro enterprises. It is obvious that the most enterprises in Europe are not the big ones. Most of workers are working in micro and small enterprises, and the emerging economy probably will reinforce this tendency. Finally, we consider that we have to be extremely innovative. Times are changing very fast, as I mentioned, and probably the same tools and the same approaches that we have used in the past need certainly to be adapted. So in this common endeavor, the European Commission will continue to be really committed with that. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jesus. Our next speaker, David Haggerty, is an Assistant Secretary at the Department of Business, Enterprise and Innovation, where he heads up the department's Enterprise Strategy, Competitiveness and Evaluation Division. Will you please welcome David Haggerty? Thank you.
Thank you, Richard, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Just to say on behalf of the Department of Business, Enterprise and Innovation, I'm delighted to be here at this 30th anniversary conference for the Health and Safety Authority, and we are certainly dealing with a very topical issue and one that goes to the heart of what Future Jobs Ireland is about. And I'm going to say a little bit about that now and give you a short overview of Future Jobs, but first a short video.
Future Jobs Ireland is about creating the future that we want. Economic development has always been driven by technological change, and we can be certain that more change is ahead.
So Future Jobs places a strong focus on increasing productivity, boosting participation rates in the labour force, so we can take advantage of technological changes and embed them in all parts of our country.
I genuinely believe that the Future Jobs Ireland launch and the strategy that is contained within it is really, really important to our economy.
We have a country with great people and great businesses, and I'm confident that if we prepare now for tomorrow's economy, we will write the best chapter yet.
So there you go, that was the executive summary. I just want to say a little bit more, but as I said, you've kind of got it in a nutshell there. But essentially, I suppose, Future Jobs, I mean, by way of context, I suppose, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, our economy is in a pretty good place, as we all know. Economic growth remains very strong, employment continues to expand very rapidly, and we are rapidly approaching a situation of full employment. However, I think we need to be all mindful that there are still a number of vulnerabilities in our economic model and approach. We are very reliant on certain key sectors and markets for foreign direct investment, for trade, and indeed for tax revenue. And our very success, particularly of our multinational sector, has perhaps obscured over the years a pretty disappointing productivity performance in much of our SME sector. Some key sectors of our economy, our productivity levels are well below European Union averages. And of course, as we all know, we face a number of very challenging international trends, increasing trade tensions, developments in tax policy, and of course the kind of looming threat of Brexit, which remains with us. So Future Jobs in a way is designed to address some of those vulnerabilities, and I think looking further ahead to try to prepare our economy and society for some of the various technological changes that Margarita referred to earlier, robotisation, AI. We know these are going to bring about big changes and disruptions to our society and to our economy. So we need to prepare for those, and we also need to prepare for a transition to a low carbon economy. So that is going to also have considerable disruptive effects. And Future Jobs really is about trying to tackle these vulnerabilities in our economy and society and prepare for these future challenges. So just maybe in a little bit more detail, against the background of those factors, Future Jobs aims at a number of key goals: stronger productivity growth, particularly in our underperforming Indigenous sectors and firms, making sure that our businesses, our workers, and indeed our communities are prepared and help to prepare for these significant transitions to a low carbon and digital future. And all of this is organised around what we call 5 pillars. I present them here separately, but as I think you'll see, all of these pillars are strongly linked. So the first pillar is around making sure that we embrace the opportunities of innovation and the various technological changes that previous speakers have referred to. This is very closely linked to the second pillar, which is about improving SME productivity. So that addresses things like managerial capacity, helping firms digitalise and reaping the productivity benefits that those can bring. Third pillar is really absolutely fundamental to what Future Jobs is about: improving the skills and talent of all of our workers, and in particularly a strong focus on the need for lifelong learning, which is going to be very, very important as we prepare many of the people who are already in the workforce, how are we going to help them adapt to these significant changes in the economy and the workplace over the coming decades? Fourth pillar is around making sure that we afford every citizen the opportunity to participate in the labour market, helping older workers stay longer in the labour market and people with disabilities. And that includes measures around remote working that Sharon spoke about earlier, and sort of looking at new and different ways that maybe make it easier for people to get a foothold in the labour market and to stay in it for longer. And the final pillar then is really around the low carbon economy. This is very closely linked to the government's climate change policy, and it really our pillar of future jobs is about trying to seize the opportunities that the transition to a low carbon economy will bring about. It will lead to job losses in some areas. We're already seeing that in the Midlands, but we need to think about the new areas of employment that a low carbon economy can give rise to. So this is just a little slide on kind of the architecture of future jobs. I'm not going to spend too long on this, but each of these 5 pillars contains a set of what we call ambitions, or they are objectives. Our objectives are really set with a 2025 time frame. Under each of those ambitions then you've got a series of deliverables, or things that departments and agencies have to deliver by a certain date and time. We have targets, 2025 targets for each of the 5 pillars, and each of these things then has a clear kind of time frame and responsible actor. And on the slide there you can see the deliverables for a number of actions under the ambition around fostering participation in the labour force, and this includes things like remote working, which my own department is doing research on, and also measures to improve work-life balance. So that's Future Jobs 2019. We're right in the middle of implementation now, obviously. We monitor progress and we produce a progress report every 6 months. By the way, when I say we, I should also mention that this Future Jobs Ireland is led by my department jointly with the Department of Taoiseach. So we work very closely with our colleagues in the Department of Taoiseach. We produced a 6-monthly report in July, and we were at a 76% completion rate then for outputs in the first half of 2019. We have to look ahead, and we're right in the middle of preparing for Future Jobs 2020. It's been a very significant and ongoing consultation process around this. We've had consultations with different government departments, business groups, agencies, including the HSA of course, and with the social partners. We held our own national summit on the 7th of November. Richard was the master of ceremonies there again, and that included addresses by Taoiseach, Minister Humphreys. We had 6 government ministers there, a keynote speaker from the World Economic Forum, Zadia Zahidi, who talked about the work of the World Economic Forum in terms of preparing for the skills needs that the new economy will bring about. And she talked about the need for a reskilling revolution. And this is the kind of agenda that we're trying to address in Future Jobs. So we're right in the middle of that. We will hope to publish Future Jobs 2020 in February. The 5-pillar structure will remain, but we are looking at 3 cross-cutting themes around smart working, transitioning, that's about preparing workers and citizens for these changes to a digital and green future, and clustering. How can we get clusters of our small and medium enterprises, of our multinational firms and higher education institutions working together to promote higher productivity levels? And we hope to maybe adopt kind of a slightly more different emphasis in terms of how we organise our deliverables and present them. So that's it in a nutshell, Richard. Happy to look forward to the discussion, and thanks again for the opportunity to present here.
David, thank you very much. And our final speaker of the session is Dr. Michael Gillan, and he's a senior executive with Biopharmachem Ireland, where he has responsibility for environment, health and safety, and he's also the head of occupational health and safety policy in IBEC. Will you please welcome Dr. Michael Gillan? Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, and thanks to the HSA for the invitation to speak today. It's funny, when I was listening to Sharon earlier on and she was saying, what will work be like in 2049. I was waiting for it to say, and the British Prime Minister will still be going looking for an extension to Brexit, but she held back, so I thought I'd use it. This is a really interesting topic for us in IBIC because in 2018, we launched a campaign called Smarter World, Smarter Work. And the reason we did was because the feedback we were getting from our companies was that the world of work was changing and we had to be part of it. And the idea was really to prepare Ireland for this new era that we're talking about here today. Issues, and you've heard them, like globalization, digitalization, and so on and so forth were there. But so are new consumer preferences. And if you go back to Margarita's presentation when she talked about the new Amazon thing, the reason being you want it. You don't want to shop the way you traditionally shopped. I defy any of you to say you won't be buying something over the weekend on a concept called Black Friday that was only introduced 9 years ago. So consumers, I'm with you, Chris, I won't be buying anything either. But the point being, you're the reason this change is happening. So it's not happening in isolation. So don't believe it's happening in isolation. So the campaign we launched last year, it's kind of built around 4 key areas. And the areas we're looking at are the investments in skills and employability, flexibility at all life stages. And I know later on Alan's going to talk about the Asian workforce, which I slightly object to because I'm now in it. Flexibility at all life stages. And we are going to be working longer. And that's for a myriad of reasons, but we are going to be working longer. One of those reasons being because we'll be healthier and we'll choose to. And the other area we're going to look at is smooth career changes, because the day of having one job for life is nearly over. There's a really good book called The 100-Year Life, and if you only get one book for the Christmas reading list, buy it. And it basically looks at the fact that a kid born in the year 2007 has a greater than 50% probability of living to the age of 100. So your traditional 20-year of education, 40-year of work, and 20-year of retirement model is blown asunder. So we need to consider a smarter way of working in the future. And to date in IBIC, we've published 3 reports around this area. One looked at graduate skills, one looked at career guidance, and not just career guidance for kids leaving school, but career guidance for people who are transitioning careers throughout their life. And also we've started looking at the area around gender pay gap, and we brought out a report earlier this year called Mind the Gap, which was an introduction to this concept. But the 4th report we're launching, and it'll be launched early in Q1 of 2020, in our Smarter World, Smarter Work campaign, looks at the future of occupational safety and health in Ireland. And it sits under the dynamic labour market pillar of our campaign. We model it on the ILO report, and if any of you haven't downloaded the ILO report on the safety and health of the future of work, you really need to, because it's one of the best publications they've produced in the last 100 years of their existence, so compliments to everyone in the ILO. But what our report looks at is integrating occupational safety and health performances into business productivity, because that's been the key to our growth as employers in the last 30 years. Like, it's a not inconsequential thing that the Framework Directive was published in 1989. The Health and Safety Authority came into existence in 1989. And that's really when we saw the growth of Irish economies to where they are today. But pause for a moment, because if you look at how we as employers advocate to integrate OSH performance into businesses, the critical piece for us is how to do it and who to do it. And there's a really good hint if you go and look at the 2005 Act, because under the definitions or the interpretations of the various actors, the employer is defined as the person under whose control and direction an employee works. And we talk about onus on employers, and they have to do this and they have to do that. And in fact, there's duties on employees too, and we can cover those too. But the critical piece is the person under whose control and direction an employee works. So it's not an entity, it's not one individual, it's anyone under whose control and direction we work. And if we look at the real strength of how health and safety legislation has encouraged industry to grow the way it has, it's because it's introduced the concept of risk assessment. because the risk assessment process affords us with the necessary controls to safely work in all environments, the hazardous ones included. And it's by expanding this role of risk assessment that we can further integrate occupational safety and health performance into our business growth moving forward. Just to labour the point on the importance of risk assessment, 4 years ago in 2015, the Commission published the report of an ex-post evaluation on the OSHA key, and the overriding finding was the results showed that the existing legislation is generally fit for purpose. Yes, there'll be needs to review. Yes, there'll be needs where the priorities need to change and maybe methods need to be adapted, but the fundamentals were sound. So don't wait for legislation to tell you how to future-proof your business from an OSH perspective. We have the fundamentals. Don't wait for policymakers to tell you how to do it, because it tends to lag in this area. And in fact, if you talk to businesses today, you'll hear them talking about technologies that haven't been dreamt of yet, because that's how the future is going to evolve. One of the speakers also referenced the concept of anticipating new risks, because believe you me, we will get new risks as we grow our businesses into areas we haven't considered yet. And it's this anticipation of us risk that you're going to hear from William in the second session, but the likes of EU OSHA based in Bilbao, they've been so good with their foresight exercises in kind of alerting us into this is coming down the track, consider this in doing it. And I'd like to share an example of how we as employers have taken on board what they're saying. Because how you adapt to a risk really reflects on how your business can incorporate it to grow its performance. I think we can all agree that over the last 15, 20 years, the concept of psychosocial risk has got an awful lot more airtime than it ever had before. And a couple of years ago in IBIC, we published a short wee little guide called An Employer's Guide to Mental Health in the Workplace. It was done in conjunction with all of the charities, and it was a colleague of mine who led the initiative inside. But the main finding of this guide, and it's available on our website, just put it into the search engine and you can download it, was that a positive and proactive approach to the management of mental health problems has significant benefits in terms of reducing absenteeism and driving greater productivity. Psychosocial risks require additional attention. And someone referenced earlier on the Work Positive tool from the HSA. It is a fantastic place to start on your journey of risk assessing psychosocial risks. But if you're going to do this, you have to consider it in terms of what you as an employer are trying to do. And the focus of that guide, it looked at providing information and direction for employers to manage, something that we were uncomfortable managing. And not everyone does it well. Some of you sitting here listening and going, oh yeah, I could do an awful lot better. Until you're challenged with this, you don't realize how difficult it is. Because what this report highlighted was that the strategies that are needed need to be done in a different way to previous strategies. And what it critically did, this report, was it acknowledged the role of the line managers as key players in doing this. So I'm back to my expanded definition of the employer, the person under whose control and direction an employee works. Because if the line manager is aware of it, if they're part of the solution in addressing mental health problems in members of their teams, dealing with problems in the workplace and underline the importance of intervention as early a stage as possible, then we can make progress. Richard Branson is a very well-known businessman the world over. And many years ago, he was quoted as saying, the way you treat your employees is the way they treat your customers. So if your employees are sick or injured, they cannot work. And if this is because of work, you as an employer has a problem. So if you don't do something about the problem, your business will not succeed. So if I go back to why we're driving this Smarter Work, Smarter World campaign within IBIC, it's to focus on integrating occupational safety and health performance into driving increased business productivity. So I'd love to leave you with a takeaway thought. And it paraphrases, a wise man once upon a time says, if you give me a fish, I'll eat for a day. If you teach me to fish, I'll eat for a lifetime. So I'm going to paraphrase it slightly. If you give me a risk assessment, I'm safe for the day. But if you teach me to risk assess, I'm safe for the future. Thank you very much indeed.
Michael, thank you very much. I'd like to ask the other speakers to come up on stage and take a seat over here. Margarita, Joakim, Jesus, David, to join Michael as well. And we can throw it open to the floor. Lots of thoughts and ideas and trends and challenges and issues there to tackle. We have some roving mics, so if anyone has a question, just put your hand up and we'll get a microphone to you. It might be helpful if you said who you were or what perspective you were coming from in relation to that. So I'll throw it open straight away. Anyone got any first question out of the traps? No? Oh, we have one. This gentleman here in the centre. Thank you.
Hello.
Yeah, it's working. You're okay. Yeah.
It's working okay. Is it grand? Herbert Mulligan from Health and Safety Review. I'm wondering if, in looking at the future of work, one of the current issues that's coming up relatively recently is the distance that people have to travel to work. And in a way, while we don't take that into account in occupational health and safety, to what extent is it a health and safety issue and needs to be considered?
Okay. Anyone want? Margarita, do you want to take that? I mean, people often talk about remote working, but this is actually maybe working in the centre of work in an office or a workplace environment, but commuting as a health and safety issue.
This is something that it's a very good point, but it's very difficult to see how that might be regulated. I think you have all kinds of regulations coming in on working time, or especially for example, if you're going to be on the road as well. But there's very little account given to the amount of driving and concentration that you're spending actually on your commute into work. So I think it's a very good point. I really don't have an answer on how to solve that issue.
Michael, from an employer's point of view, it strikes me a couple of speakers talked about psychosocial risks. And to some extent, this is a psychosocial risk, isn't it? And from a productivity, and if an increasing percentage of your workforce are spending more time commuting, it affects their productivity, it affects their psychological well-being, etc. How big a factor do you think that may be for employers?
I think it's a really enormous factor, and one of the challenges really when you consider travelling to your place of work is, if we're brutally honest, how many of us have to do it. But we're stuck in a mindset of how we've always done it. And I'll give an example of, so in IBIC we get queries from companies who are setting up in the state. And last summer, a company are setting up a presence in Ireland. They're employing 300 people, and they don't have a central office. Now, I can't comprehend how you work in that environment. Probably back to Alan's point of being an Asian worker. I don't know. I know my kids can. And that's going to be one of the biggest challenges for us as employers to understand. Because
But if it's very difficult for government, as Margarita has said, to try to think about this, or for regulators, what about the role for employers to take it into account?
Government can't legislate for that unless they go and talk to these employers. And some of these employers, like I'll be dealing with a company this afternoon, and they have multiple regions. There'll be about 27 on the call, 12 of whom are outside of the European Union. So they'd be working remote all around the world. And yet so this is what I'm saying. Legislation isn't going to drive this, Richard. Legislation, and we were always told this when we started off with Peter Sartre years ago in UCD, it's a minimum standard. So it's how employers who want to grow it, and it is the ones who'll embrace this. They'll be the ones who'll succeed. But the ones who choose to bury their head in the sand in this, they're going nowhere.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Michael. Any other questions? We have one over on this side here. We get a mic.
I'd just like to comment on the previous speaker in terms of the journey to work and how it affects people both in terms of the quality of life and their whole social status. I think there's a real need for a mindset and a policy change in terms of how we travel and the distances we travel in terms of the usage of public transport and, say, designated bus corridors, for example, which would give guaranteed journey times and possibly park and ride facilities to ease the burden on people and improve their quality of life.
Thank you very much. So there can be a policy response in that sense. It isn't just about employers and employees. Any other questions? Yes, at the back here, this gentleman.
Good morning. Victor Rymack from the Technological University of Dublin, School of Food Science, Environmental Health. I'd like to ask the Commissioner and Mr. Nunez, one of the things that I would have thought this summit would have covered would be what is the position with regard to the regulation of all these new standards that we are expecting. At the moment, in Europe, there is a decrease in the amount of labour inspectorate regulation and an increase in the private sector regulating. But there are a lot of problems with that, especially in the small and medium-sized enterprises. And Mr. Gillan made a very good point. Give me a risk assessment and it'll make me safe. Only if your employer actually allows the risk assessment to be implemented. So what is coming down the line, especially from the European Commission, to redress the balance of regulation in the workplace, which has been dropping since the framework?
So to the European Commission, Jesus, is that a question you want to take there?
Certainly, there is a need to keep this balance you mentioned, and the Commission is certainly very well aware of that, because on one hand, regulation is necessary. Somehow is necessary to put the rights and obligations of everyone, employers and workers, but it is obvious that it is not enough. Another aspect is it comes related to compliance and to enforcement. And it is clear, and I think you mentioned that, the number of labor inspectors.
Yeah, can we just get that? Do we have a roving mic that we might be able to get up here for Jesus? Yeah, we'll get a mic up to you now. A handheld mic, Jesus. Yeah, apologies for that. Yeah, there you go. Thank you.
Is working now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
No, I was mentioning the need to keep this balance in regulation, but also to ensure that member states, because at the end of the day, is for member states to ensure that the regulation is properly applied and properly implemented. Especially over the years of the crisis, we are aware of the fact that the number of labor inspectors decreased in some countries in particular, no? And this is not only an issue of related to numbers, it's an issue related to the training and the knowledge of the inspectors. Some of you are labor inspectors, and you know very well in the future of the perspective of the future of work that it is necessary also to be updated on the new risk. So this is some elements that we consider that has to be taken into account in the respect of this element. Thank you very much.
Just aside from the regulation, the question also Michael raised this question of risk assessment and conducting one's own risk assessment, and it raises the point of what about the outcome of the risk assessment? Maybe to some extent some of the changes will fall on the employee to become more aware about certain things, but also what about the willingness of the employer to respond to the outcome of that assessment?
It's a really valid point Victor makes, because if risk assessment is done in isolation of the worker, it's only a piece of paper. It's not a risk assessment, because the concept of risk assessment is tell me have I adequate controls needed to do my job. And when you have people working in an environment, I always say the most knowledgeable person of any job is usually the person doing it. So unless you're availing of the knowledge they're generating, risk assessments are meant to be a dynamic process. So you're getting the feedback from the people who are being exposed to the risks. So it is actually a two-way dialogue process.
If I was running a company and I said, to the employees, I want you all to do your own risk assessments and come back to me, would I be opening up a hell of a can of worms that I might not be willing to respond to?
If you were running a company and you did risk assessment without engaging with your employees, you'd be opening up in a bigger can of worms.
Okay, great, thank you. We have another question here at the front. We can get a mic down. Thank you.
Meet you in the middle. I want to make an initial comment, if you don't mind, in terms of the title of this summit. I think it's hugely important. It talks about the future of workers and work as distinct from just this inanimate thing called the future of work. So I think kudos to Sharon and the HSA on the title of this summit in the first instance. In terms of risk assessment and in terms of workers, can you comment a little bit on your perspective on the generational shifts that are happening? In other words, the importance of 5 generations in the workplace at once, and in particular on the younger generations that are coming into the workforce, and how that might change the psychosocial risks, and how can we adapt to that new world, if you don't mind.
Yeah, no, I gladly will, and apologies if I'm hogging it a fraction, but this concept of generation is so important, because while when we talk about the future of work, we all automatically assume everything is online. There will still be really productive manufacturing plants in Ireland. We will still be one of the greatest food producers on the planet. So there will always be manual construction, labour and manufacturing work taking place. So let's not presume it's all gone online. It's not. So that concept of the multiple generations is critical. And that's why it's the learnings of that. We've only been doing modern health and safety law in Ireland for 30 years, and we've learned an awful lot. And it's to leverage that learning to talk about the next 30 years. My 2 daughters are 26 and 23. They're now in the workforce. They do things that takes them about 12 seconds that would take me a day and a half to do. Their speed of thought, they communicate in multi-channels. I'm a one-channel person. I can read the paper, I can watch the telly. I can't do both. They're reading 2 or 3 papers on their phones while watching things, while doing work. So if we try and make policy in the absence of younger workers as they migrate fully into the workforce, we're not doing them a service. And that's why it's important to empower people, to train them, if you want to call it training, but to empower people to understand the concept of what good risk assessment does. It facilitates us doing things. I'm one of these half-glass full people. I hate when people use health and safety in a negative sense. For me, it's an enabler. It allows me to do any job I want, so long as I risk assess it and ensure the controls in place. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to talk to younger workers migrating into the workforce to explain that's what they're doing. We're enabling them. I used to use the analogy that it's like driving your car. Anyone who drove today, you did at least 100 risk assessments and you didn't even know you were doing them. The trouble with the younger workers is they don't drive. So we have to figure another analogy to explain the concept of risk assessment.
Michael, thank you very much. Just before we go to the next question, if you wouldn't mind, if you could get your phones out, we'll come to in a second. We have a couple of Slido polls here that it would be great to get your feedback on. There's a question there, it's question 3. Which of the below do you think presents the greatest challenge for the future of workers and work? Is it remote working, automation and robotics, changing employment status, contracts? Is it aging workforce, or is it artificial intelligence? So we can see well up the top is remote working, 39%. Changing employment status / contracts is second, and now that's reversed. So basically they're the two that are well out. Aging workforce is on about 12%, automation and robotics about 10%. So it's interesting that as we settle it now, the main one, 47%, is changing employment status and contracts. Okay, thank you very much. And another question, what proportion of your employees have some form of remote working option open to them? Is it none? Is it about a quarter? Is it roughly half? Or is it most or all? And it's interesting to see how high up most or all is there. We're sort of divided between most or all and then somewhere around the 25% mark or a quarter. So most or all is on 39%, and about a quarter on 29%. So it's interesting. Just on that point, Margarita, a couple of things that you mentioned. One of them was about, you gave the example of the Amazon factory of the future, and I wondered about whatever implications that change might have when it comes about fully. What about the difficulty and challenges for the transition until we get to that point? So, for example, maybe for the people working in the factory during a transition towards more automation or robotics, not the end result. And do you think that there's enough planning and thought goes into the risks for the transition period?
And by transition, do you mean the kind of a stage
where it's half and half and it's on the way, and you've greater proximity, let's say in a manufacturing situation with humans and automation?
On the one hand, I think if you're a firm who really want, and if you're trying to improve health and safety in your warehouse, I'm sure you're thinking about investing in these technologies as a way to actually protect your workforce. At the same time, I think there's we have to recognize that, I suppose, the machines in these kind of warehouses work at a certain speed, and it can be very challenging for a worker to keep up with that speed physically. And then there's also machine repair, which itself is associated with injuries. So if we're talking about how the actual humans and robots or machines are working together, there's certainly a danger of injury there. And then obviously if you could imagine a warehouse being completely automated or completely robots, I think you would in general find, because there are fewer workers there, I suppose your health and safety stats would improve, or your workplace injuries would certainly decrease, even though there would still be risks. As I gave that example to really talk about, there might be this vision of a human-free workplace, but actually our jobs kind of change and evolve. It's not a case that workers disappear. It's just that there's transitions in the way we work, and so the challenge is really to think about those transitions. And then one other transition that would happen in that case is that, where do these workers go? Well, they're going into other occupations, and so there's a certain amount of retraining there. And so, that can also be a point where there's a challenge ensuring that people have the right training to enable them to carry out work safely in their new occupations.
And that's something that can be prepared for. Now, any other questions? We have this lady here at the front. We can get a microphone over to you. Thank you.
Chris Rowland from Irish Congress of Trade Unions. I have actually 2 points to make, really. One is in relation to the need for early education and training of the workforce. I believe, because that has two benefits. First of all, workers, when they're properly trained and educated in relation to the job, makes them more safe workers, and it helps towards the employer with their safety in the workplace. The second is in relation to the fact that jobs are constantly changing. A recent, down in the Midlands, there's a lot of job losses currently. Government are talking about retrofitting this, that and the other, which is fine, but the reality of it, how many of those workers, given their age, their status, and where they are currently, are going to be able to benefit from that. So I think governments, whether it's this government or a government somewhere else, need to put more resources and earlier resources into the development and training of workers. And secondly, I was a little bit concerned about the video that David showed about the future of work. However, he retrieved the situation because he mentioned it himself. Society. Do we want to have an economy? Do we want this country to be an economy, or do we want it to be a society? You know, why can't we have a bit of both? And it is, with Marguerite's presentation, from a trade union perspective, it's a bit nerve-wracking, to say the least, as to how people and workers are going to be treated in the future if they have no protection and some organisations to protect them. and we can't leave it all up to employers to train and develop. The governments are going to have to put in money to support.
Okay, thank you very much. Any responses to that? No, you're going to take those comments on board. Okay, any other questions then? There was one question that, and it featured in the Slido there, was the role of the changing employment status and contracts, which I think feeds into some of the comments that have been made. And it was in your own presentation there, Margarita, you looked at how legislatively other countries were responding to this as an issue. And you talked about, I think it may have been in the Lithuanian case, that there needed to be training of individuals in all circumstances, regardless of their employment status within the organisation, on various workstations or whatever it is. Do you see that as something that will grow and increase, and is this something that will become a bit of a battleground between legislators and employers ultimately?
I think the point of our survey was to really see what were the priorities of policymakers in terms of regulation and keeping up with and responding to changes in work. So I think, all of our 44 countries that responded really wanted to, and these are ministries of labour generally, they wanted to tell us about all these initiatives they had going on. And I think, there was sufficient focus on some of the challenges for occupational safety and health, and some recognition of the specific challenges that people in non-standard employment would face. And thanks to Chris, was it for the point about how really the new forms of work are in many cases quite precarious and bring many risks, not just safety and health risks. So so I gave the example of in Lithuania, they were making sure that generally workplace regulations, well, they're tied to the workplace. So in a sense, your employment status shouldn't matter, but actually you could imagine the dynamics of the working relationship in fact mattering. For example, if you're a temp worker, or if you're even a contractor who's working on site, you're going to have more first days in a workplace than anyone else, or in a particular workstation, just because you're moving from place to place, and that's when the injury rate can be extremely high. And then the Estonian or the Lithuanian example showed how they were recognizing that, well, temp agency workers, okay, they may have received some training from the agency, but it's not going to be specific to the workplace and to the tools that they're using at their workstation for each job they do. So I think that was a recognition of that challenge. In terms of other ones, for example, the topic of this contractor status or dependent self-employment, we call it the grey zone in the OECD, where you're you have some dependencies on an employee, dependencies on an employer or on a firm similar to an employee, but at the same time your contract is that you're self-employed. And so there's examples in Italy and Spain, I think, of where they set up, they set up special, they tried to extend elements of employment protections to people who fall into this grey zone between employment and self-employment. And in some cases that was driven in part by an effort to improve occupational safety and health. Okay. So I think we did see some
there
measures
are examples
to improve,
of it around, yes.
to respond to these challenges.
Just a final point, I wanted to ask Joakim and Jesus and David as well. I didn't see your phones out on the Slido there, so I thought I might ask you guys the question. How would you answer on the Slido? Which of the below do you think presents the greatest challenge for the future of workers and work? Joakim, remote working, automation, changing employment status, aging workforce, or artificial intelligence?
Well, that's a very difficult one. So I didn't get the code to answer the slide, so that's why I wasn't able to do that. So I would say for me, most probably, I would say remote work.
Remote work is the biggest challenge.
Yes, because also because not only because of the direct or immediate risks to situation, people may be exposed, but also because of isolation.
Okay.
And all the psychosocial effects.
And psychosocial
and also
impacts.
lack of representation.
Sure. Jesus, what would it be for you?
Actually, I have a doubt between remote work and robotization, automation, because, but I have the impression that personally, the robotization, automation can be more relevant in my view.
And David?
Actually, I did answer that question, Richard.
Oh, you did. You were in there. Sorry about that.
But I find myself in a considerable minority here. I went for artificial intelligence.
Right.
Because it's a general purpose technology. I think its effects will be absolutely pervasive. It may be to the 21st century what the steam engine was to the 19th century. And so I went for that, but I hope I'm wrong in a way.
Thank you very much to our panelists, to Margarita, to Joakim, to Jesus, to David, and to Michael. Thank you very much. Now we're going to have a well-earned coffee break, and we'll be back in 20 minutes at 11:22. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to start our second panel. If you could take your seats, please, that would be great. We're about to start. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think you've all enjoyed a cup of coffee and a good chat, and I think we're pretty much all back. So I'd like to kick off our second panel of the morning, and this panel deals with OSH, a competitive advantage to a sustainable workforce and quality jobs. And we have 4 speakers, and then we'll have a full panel, and Dr. Sharon Mcginnis is going to join us for the panel Q&A at the end, and there'll be an opportunity for you guys to ask some questions, so please do. Our first speaker in this session is Barbara Gersten. She is head of the Working Life Unit at Eurofound, and this is the unit which is conducting the European Working Conditions Survey. Will you please welcome Barbara Gersten.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you for giving Eurofound the opportunity to present some of our findings and to contribute to your very important debate. Eurofound is the short form of the name of the rather long name of a European agency, the European Foundation for the Improvement of Living and Working Conditions. And even though we are a European agency, we are based here in Dublin, basically just down the road in Loughlinstown. Now I'm going to expand the discussion a little bit by bringing in the dimension of sustainable work and the question, what do we need to ensure that the work of the future is sustainable work? Now, what do we mean with sustainable in the context of work? Just to make clear, I'm not talking about green jobs. When we talk about making work sustainable, we think about making living and working conditions such that they support people in engaging and remaining in work throughout an extended working life. So that means that work must be transformed to eliminate the factors that discourage or hinder workers from staying in or entering the workforce. Why is that important? Well, the main driver behind this is demographic change. And I think Professor Barrett will later on talk more about the Irish situation. But if you look at the member states in the European Union, the vast majority of them not only have a shrinking working age population, they also have an aging working age population. So fewer people available to work, and among those who are at working age, a higher share of those above 55 years of age, and those are, much to my dismay as well, as Michael was saying earlier, considered older workers. So if our jobs, if job quality is such that only male, prime age workers in full capacity, full possession of their physical and mental skills, with absolutely no care responsibility, are catered for, then we have a problem, because we simply have too few people with these characteristics. The other thing that we need to take into account is that the availability for work differs and is likely to change over the life course. So the challenge is that we match the needs and abilities of the individual as they change over the life course with the quality of jobs that we offer. And one key element in making work sustainable over the life course is making it possible for workers to achieve a good balance between work and non-working life. So in other words, we need work-life balance for our workers. And this is what I want to focus on today. How is work-life balance connected to sustainable work? Well, not being able to reconcile paid employment with other commitments outside paid work can be a barrier to employment. The European Labour Force Survey gives us some figures here. In 2017, 9% of the female working age population were not seeking employment or were not seeking working full-time because they were caring for children or adults in needs of care. 9% EU average. In Ireland, but also in Germany and in Austria, this figure was as high as 15% of female working age population. This reason is almost never mentioned by men, by the way. I'm not seeking employment, I'm not seeking full-time employment because of my care responsibilities, just as an aside. Not all of these workers, of course, want to work or want to work full-time. I think we need to take that into account as well. But for a large group, the lack of affordable childcare is the reason that keeps them from seeking full employment. And for Ireland, and I know you will not be surprised by this, this figure stood at 3.4% in 2017. That means more than 100,000 people in this country did not seek employment or not full-time employment because of the cost and availability of childcare. And that is the highest level in the EU. But it's not only people who are outside of the workforce. Achieving work-life balance is also important for those in work. Not being able to achieve good work-life balance can be a reason to leave the labor force early. In the European Working Conditions Survey, Richard mentioned it before, a big survey, more than 30,000 workers interviewed face-to-face all over Europe. In that survey, we have a question that asks, do you think you will be able to do your current job at the age of 60? And for those over 55, we ask, do you think you will be able and willing to do your current job in 5 years' time? And there is a clear correlation between those who say, no, I don't think so, or no, I don't want to, and those reporting, my work-life balance is poor. I find it difficult to combine working hours with my responsibilities and wishes outside of work. Now, the good news is that according to the European Working Conditions Survey, the majority of workers in the EU say that in general, their working hours fit well or even very well with their family commitments. So that's 80% of workers in the European Union. And for Ireland, this figure is even higher at 85%. So let's now have a look at the remaining 20% that do find it difficult to combine working hours with other commitments. And since, as I said earlier, the need for work-life balance changes as you go through working life, I have given you here a stylized depiction of how work-life balance needs and results change over the life course. So the first thing that we see here, blue are men, and the green dots are women. The first thing that we see that men find it more difficult to achieve work-life balance than women. And especially in the child-raising phase. Why is that so? Well, one of the most important predictors for work-life balance, poor work-life balance, is the volume of work. So look at this graph. What happens when workers reach the age and the situation, the family situation, where they have to combine or want to combine work with caring for children? As you can clearly see from the green dots, women reduce their working time. As you can also see from the blue dots, men not only not do that, working time actually increases for men during this time. And one of the explanations is supposedly that if women in couples reduce their working time, someone has to make up for the loss of income. Important, I think, for policymakers in this room, and that includes decision makers in companies, I would argue, important to note is this is not what men want. If you ask them about working time preferences, this is what you're going to see. That men in this phase of their lives have a high preference for working less if income was not an issue. So that is something I think we need to keep in mind, because it means when we are talking about work-life balance, we should focus on men and not necessarily on women. But it's not only the volume of work, and I have a list here now with other factors that play an important role for achieving good work-life balance. So working time, I already discussed. Commuting time, unsurprisingly, also plays a role, and we've discussed it already this morning, and all I can say is hello Dublin when it comes to commuting time and work-life balance. But another important aspect is working time regularity. If it is difficult to predict when I'm going to work, for how long I'm going to work, that makes it so much more difficult to find a good balance between work and non-work. And if we now think about new developments on the labor market, the increase in casual work, in zero-hour contracts, in short-term contracts, etc., this predictability of working time and the regularity is clearly a point, an issue, a problem that's going to increase, which means our problems to achieve work-life balance are going to increase. Atypical working hours also do not work and do not help. Night work, shift work, but also weekend work is not good for work-life balance. And again, if we look at the sectoral shift in the economy and the fact that more and more people work in services where the likelihood of, because of customer demand, because of clients waiting, because of patients waiting, that you have to work weekends, that you have to work nights, again, this will be an increasing problem in the future. Job intensity is also very important. High demands at work, a very fast pace, never enough time to do the job, several pace determinants, and it's not only the boss who tells you what to do and what to achieve, it's also the client putting pressure on you. So several pace determinants. That leads to stress, and stress leads to work-life conflicts. We have a few questions in the European Working Conditions Survey where we ask, how often in a month do you feel too tired to work, too tired after work to do housework? How often do you worry about work when not working? How often do you feel that the job prevents time to give sufficient time to your family? And for all these indicators, we see an increase. And this type of stress leading to work-life conflicts leads then also to a poor situation, to a poor view on work-life balance. Let's look at the next one, the positive one, the green one. Support at work can help. a supportive manager, supportive colleagues can balance out the difficulties of balancing work and non-work life. And I come back to that in a moment. Care responsibility, I think I already indicated that. All those who, again, in the working conditions survey, indicate that they have care responsibilities find it very difficult to combine work and non-work life. Flexibility of working hours is actually a bit of a mixed blessing, a mixed message here. Flexibility is good to be able to adjust working time to your own needs. However, what we also see, looking at this graph, that only about a third of workers in Europe have this possibility to either decide working hours entirely by themselves, or that they can choose, and that's the green, the yellow part here, that they can choose between several fixed working schedules determined by the company, or that they can adapt working hours within certain limits. And Ireland, the red arrow there, is a little below EU average there, and the Nordic countries to the very right-hand side in the red box are much better in that respect. However, what is also interesting to note is that this light blue part, working hours are entirely determined by the worker. That actually is not good for work-life balance. And that points to a fact that self-exploitation, if you have complete autonomy over your working time, is a real issue. And I will come back to that in a moment when we talk about telework. So this is the situation for working time flexibility. A very important point to note here is that a little can go a long way. And what I mean here is that the possibility to take 1 hour off at work, the crash calls, child has a temperature, father needs to pick up the child. Is that possible? Does the boss agree? Do the colleagues agree you can do that? That makes a huge impact on how people see their work-life balance. Last point, working at home, teleworking. Does that help to achieve better work-life balance, or does it not? In principle, yes. Those people who work regularly from home, we see in the working conditions survey, report a better work-life balance. At the same time, they are also the ones that report much more often than those working from the employer's premises all the time, that they work more than 48 hours a week, that they work in their free time in order to keep up with work demands, and that they get less than 11 hours rest per day between the end of one working day and the beginning of the next. So it is also here a rather mixed blessing. And even worse, for what we call highly mobile workers, those who do not only work from home, but also from other premises, not only a couple of times a month, but a couple of times a week, their work-life balance is not helped by this possibility to work remotely. A lot more on this in the full report, but maybe just to summarize the most important points. Giving workers the possibility to achieve a good work-life balance is a prerequisite for making work sustainable. The volume of work is the most important factor. Working time flexibility helps, and a little goes a long way. That's this ability to take an hour off on short notice. Predictability is hugely important, and remote work is not necessarily a solution. Thank you.
Barbara, thank you very much. Our next speaker is William Coburn. He has worked at the European Agency for Safety and Health since 1998, and since 2012 he's been in charge of the EU OSHA's Prevention and Research Unit. Will you please welcome William Coburn? Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, HSA, not only for the opportunity to present here today, but also for the excellent collaboration since the agency was founded 25 years ago, and also the unions and the business representatives who are on our board as well. I must say it's essential for our success. The presentation I have today responds to the request from HSA, which was quite challenging really, to review future technologies and emerging risks related to the new world of work, and also policy findings and recommendations. I take that as a compliment because the agency has been running for quite some time an area of work dedicated specifically to identifying emerging and future risks related to occupational safety and health. But it'll be rather a skim through a lot of the main findings, hopefully from the work that we've carried out over the years. The first step often is really to have a look and see what are the main drivers behind the changes that we're seeing and that we're anticipating will happen. And we've heard about some of these already, but just to go through, when we're looking at automation, we're talking about not only automation of physical tasks, whether that's a new production line, a new process, or robotization, but then also automation of decision making, where we've heard about artificial intelligence, the use of algorithms, and so on. Another major development that is driving change is universal connectivity. Here we know we're always online. Real-time location is available for everyone and everything. We have fast, cheap, secure payment systems. We have access to cloud computing and so on. Another area we've looked at as well is the development of monitoring technologies. So obviously you've got sensors in your telephone. You've also maybe wearing Fitbit type devices. But with the development of the Internet of Things, we're also going to be interacting with our environment, and the potential for actually generating data about what we do at work and how we do that, and potentially what risks we're exposed to is pretty exciting. Not strictly technical, but I wanted to mention globalization, because the agreements that are struck across borders in terms of everything from standards for machinery, for data exchange, are all also important facilitators of technical development. These sorts of changes are then translated into, for instance, greater access to markets, lower transaction costs compared to how business has been done before, and also generating more innovation. And some of the ways we see that reflected in the way that we work is, for instance, how work is allocated in terms of tasks or jobs. And we've already spoken a bit about the way online platforms are doing that in the gig economy, and those online platforms are going to be moving in some cases into enterprises themselves and becoming a management tool. But also the type of outputs that we deliver and how those outputs reach us or reach the customer, changes in invoicing and payments. The smallest operator, this Uber driver, can be an economic operator, and then how performance is monitored, not only economic performance, but also potentially the individual's work performance, and in a whole host of different areas. In the presentation this morning, I'll focus on three main aspects of the changes in the forms of work. One is the contractual relationship, the other one in the organization of work, and then digitalization, more about the content. So the contractual relationship, we've touched on this already this morning. Much of the health and safety legislation is based on there being a traditional employer-employee relationship. If that relationship does not exist, the OSH legislation does not apply. Ireland is one of the very few countries, I think the UK is the only other one, that mentions self-employed in the legislation. There have been European Council resolutions in the past calling on the self-employed to be addressed, but that's not really led to much change, at least in terms of the health and safety regulations themselves. That regulatory platform is further challenged with the evolution of new forms of work that we've already heard about. So we have the triangular relationships of online platform or gig work, similar in some cases to temporary agency work. Temporary agency work does have some regulations. Platform work, online platform work, very little so far. The self-employed, as I've said, are hardly covered at all across Europe, although in Greece, for instance, self-employed represent 1 out of every 3 workers. And then, as we've heard, we've got the generation of new jobs, new relationships, such as on-call contracts, 0-hours contracts, and then, of course, not only self-employed, but false self-employed or bogus self-employed. The impact that we can see for health and safety at work are first and foremost, I think, that these groups can be excluded from any of the structures that we have in place based on our 30 years, at least with the Framework Directive, of OSH legislation. It simply does not apply. The format of that work also means that it's more challenging to control the workplace risks, there being a more distant relationship. We've heard just recently about how the precarious nature of work, the uncertainty around work, the fear of losing one's job is naturally leading to psychosocial risks. But on the other hand, the sort of opportunities that platforms offer for more casual and flexible work also allow some workers who until now have been in the undeclared part of the economy to join the more formal employment. So there's pros and cons. And of course, there's virtually no representation of workers who have these types of jobs. They have very poor access to training or any form of specialist support, any advice on health and safety or so on. I'm going to tackle the opportunities for action a bit more in detail later on in the presentation, so I won't go through them now. In terms of how work is organized, here I'm talking about where, when and how we're working. So we've just heard about home working or teleworking. There's also co-working spaces increasingly being used, principally to overcome problems around commuting. But also mobile work, work at clients' premises, and a lot of work online in terms of crowd work or click work. We also find, as Barbara was just talking, that the hours that we work are also changing from what was a more traditional approach, and we're seeing an increase in intensity. When it comes to management, people are more and more being managed by algorithms, by decisions being taken through a rather opaque mechanism. We're seeing the introduction of artificial intelligence as a human resource management tool. I think recently it was said that knowledge of artificial intelligence was one of the most important sought-after qualifications amongst HR professionals. Some of these softwares are sold on the basis of helping you identify stressed individuals before they become stressed, where there's pinch points in your processes, where there's a high work intensity. So they're being sold. There's potential for benefit, of course, but there's a lot of concern about privacy, data protection, and what use might be made of that data. When we're moving to this sort of work organization, away again from the more traditional paradigm, it makes workplace risks again more difficult to control. I've heard just in the discussion earlier about the challenges of reaching workers' premises if they're working from home to evaluate risks. How is that done in practice? And the increased risk of working long hours under high intensity, and the blurring of the homework boundary that Barbara was just speaking about. We see greater flexibility in schedules, hours and location, and that can also lead to the risk of isolation, a lack of support from colleagues, a pressure to perform, and if you're delivering these services directly to customers, then there's also an increased risk of third-party threats and violence. And I've mentioned the concerns around data and privacy. I mentioned data and privacy because I think for occupational safety and health, it is to some extent a bargain in the workplace, and you need to have some equality in the information about the work that's being carried out. As Michael was saying earlier on, you need to involve your workers, and they need to have information about what they're actually doing and how decisions are taken. If that's behind some sort of opaque wall, then those discussions about health and safety at work are not going to be as productive. And then the third dimension that I wanted to mention was about the digitalization of the work itself. So how the tasks that are being carried out are changing. We prefer to talk at EUOSHA about the tasks being automated, and that will lead to substantial changes in most jobs. In some cases, as Margarita was saying, that's going to lead to jobs disappearing, but it's going to lead to fundamental changes in the way work is actually carried out. That can be either, as I was saying, to do with automated processes, automated production lines that are changing the nature of the work, or it can be working with robots. And we've seen a move in terms of working with robots, where robots are physically separated, normally by barriers, from the workers, to having cobots, workers working alongside workers. And that photograph there is of a robot called Flippy. It's a €60,000 burger flipper, and that's actually in place already in some restaurants, only 3 in the United States, but it's the shape of what may come. And from our point of view, what's interesting is that the people who are working alongside this robot are in no way highly trained. I mean, what is the sort of person who works in a burger bar? Those are the sorts of risks that we need to be able to anticipate. In all of this, the design of the job is essential. If we automate the physical parts of the job, we may end up with a risk of increased sedentarism, longer time in static postures, and many commentators are forecasting that what this automation will lead to is a hollowing out of the job market, where we're left with the higher skilled jobs on the one hand done by humans, and the middle skilled jobs that are more easily automatable and are worth automating being done by robots or automated means. And then we'll have those jobs that are not worth automating, because every automation is a business decision. And if you have access to cheap labor, why would you bother investing in some complicated machinery? So the theory there is that it'll be a hollowing out, and we'll still have a substantial number of dull, dirty, dangerous jobs at the bottom end of the labor market. So going back to the contractual relationship, I'll just mention some of the initiatives that we've come across. As we heard, the courts at national and European level have been quite active in defining when an employment relationship actually exists. It's in a sense, it's cat and mouse. As soon as normally a platform company is told that actually they are the employers for their associates, or whatever label they've given them, then they change one of the key factors that were used to reach that decision by the courts. So it's cat and mouse, and that really highlights the need for legislative action. There have been some examples of legislative action. Margarita mentioned some. I think France in Europe is probably the one that has gone furthest, giving platform workers the right to training, to accident insurance, the right to collective representation, but it has proved very difficult to implement in practice. So one thing is to develop the legislation, another thing is to apply it. In terms of social partners, we already have a number of unions dedicated specifically to online workers, for instance, platform workers, and there are a number of codes of practice. In Germany, for instance, platform companies have come together and voluntarily developed a code. In Europe, as we heard from Jesus, the European Pillar of Social Rights is particularly looking at protecting the quality of employment, and the directive on transparent and predictable working conditions, although not specifically on occupational safety and health, is also looking at improving the rights of people under new forms of employment. When it comes to how we respond to the new forms in organisation of work, clearly for employers there's a significant challenge here in managing all of the situations. We talked about telework, how to adapt the risk assessment to the new technology, also very importantly to make sure that you're taking account of psychosocial risks and those impacts. For the inspectorates as well, a number of inspectorates are retraining their inspectors to be more aware not only of the technology, but also of broader issues in the small enterprises, particularly where they sit in a supply chain, what the other pressures might be that are affecting the performance, the management of health and safety at work. Some court decisions around this would be on the right to disconnect for workers. So they're actually workers given the legal right to say, I will not be contactable once I leave work or after a certain hour. And in some countries, the employers are taking those measures voluntarily. Data is significantly more protected since the GDPR came in, and that's an important restriction. For social partners, again, we've got specially adapted unionization online aimed at mobile workers. And we've got framework agreements at European level on telework, on prevention of stress, harassment, and violence. And a lot of these issues, as we heard from Joakim, have been particularly well addressed in the ILO's work on the future of work. When it comes to the work content, the proper implementation of new technology is crucial. We had a question for the panel earlier about how you transition from one technology to another in a warehouse. And at least in terms of health and safety and ergonomics, this is a principle that has been around forever, is that you need to think about health and safety from the earliest design stage. You need to think about the role of the human in your human-machine interface in your system. And then further down the line, you need to incorporate these factors into the risk assessment and ensure that you're getting the participation of workers. I mentioned the reskilling of labour inspectorates. Labour inspectorates also using new technology themselves, and also prevention services, consultants, support services are using new technology, online guides, online apps to help enterprises manage their risks. From the research community, I think there's still a lot of work to be done to highlight the importance of human factors, human-computer interfaces, human-machine interfaces in the design not only of the machinery that we're interacting with, but also in the job as a whole. Legislators here, I think there's a lot of work ongoing in standards. There are some very exciting smart PPE, personal protective equipment, have been developed, for instance, but they're still just in the displays at the trade shows because they can't get the standardization. It really is very challenging, and I think that's going to be one of the main issues with regards to OSH-related technology in other areas. We heard about the Commission's evaluation of the OSH legislation. For sure, it was described as being fit for purpose. The extent, as I said, to which it is able to respond to developments in technology that are so fast moving is certainly an area for concern, and that was the option that I checked on the poll from Slido. And I just, as my final slide, wanted to put this survey result in, which is from our workplace survey. We interview 45,000 enterprises across Europe about how they manage health and safety at work in practice. And one of our questions is whether you have an action plan or procedures in place to deal with psychosocial risks. And obviously some of HSA's work has borne fruit because I have to say we have some sample bias. I guess we access the better end of the spectrum, but compared to other countries in Europe, Ireland is the country, the second highest country in terms of having policies in place to deal with bullying and harassment, and well above the average when it comes to policies in place for stress and violence. And so maybe we're seeing some reaction there. And with that, I will look forward to your questions in the panel. And thank you.
Thank you very much, William. Our next speaker, I'm sure, is very well known to many, if not all of you. He's the Director of the Economic and Social Research Institute. Will you please welcome Professor Alan Barrett? Thank you.
Thanks for that, Richard. Just putting my stopwatch on to make sure I'll stay within time. So firstly, thanks to to Sharon and the HSA for the invitation to talk today. I'm going to talk specifically about the issue of older workers in the context of the future of work. And by way of sort of very, very broad context, can I just say that over the last number of years, the ESRI have been working in a research collaboration with the HSA, and we've produced a whole range of reports. Sharon touched on some of them this morning, and one of the reports we did, again, looked specifically at older workers. So some of what I'll talk about today will draw on that report, and some will be from a sort of a broader research agenda of mine. I'm not going to use any slides, okay, and I'm going to sort of talk about a number of themes, but in a nutshell, what I'm sort of trying to think here in terms of is the following. We need to create a workplace that is more likely to retain older workers. Okay, that's important, okay, that we retain older workers because we're going to need them, okay, we're going to need them for economic purposes, okay, but it's a good idea in and of itself, okay, that if they're going to have more older workers, we should have a workplace for them that is attractive and that they sort of feel that they belong in. So that's the overall theme that I'm going to be trying to address. You'll see I talk an awful lot about retirement in this presentation. So if you want to stay engaged with what I'm saying, think yourselves today. When do you think you will retire? When would you like to retire? Okay, I often ask this question, and most people's answer is now. Okay, but I'm going to try and convince you that maybe that's not the best idea ever. Okay, so let me start getting into the substance of this. So I'm going to talk about 5 themes, and then we'll summarize. Okay, so the first theme is pretty straightforward, actually, and it's simply this notion that in an aging population, which has been touched on today, we are going to need more older workers. Okay, so we often talk in terms of dependency ratios and a whole range of other things, but let me come at it from a slightly different angle. People often think about population aging in the context of people living longer, and that's part of population aging. Okay, but the other part that people forget about is the fact that fertility rates are declining is the other crucial bit of population aging. Because it's not just that we have more older people, it's that we're having fewer and fewer younger people as people have smaller and smaller numbers of children. So that's why we're getting this sort of population inversion, which obviously is a real difficulty. And another way of looking at this is the European Union have done sort of projections, workforce projections. Okay, so just think about this. If the participation rates across all the age groups stay the same and retirement ages stay the same, by about 2050, the workforce in the European Union will be about 10% lower than it is now. All right, because we're having those sort of smaller groups of younger people. Okay, so the workforce will contract if we don't keep more people in the labour force. Okay, and if the workforce is contracting, we're not going to have the sort of taxation base to fund all the important social services that we need. Okay, so I think that the case, in a sense, for having to retain people in the workforce, I think, is pretty clear. But let me also stress that we don't want a situation to arise where people are absolutely compelled to stay in the workforce. All right, choice really should be the critical issue here. So this is all about how are we going to create a workforce where people choose to stick around for longer, okay, not necessarily just that they're compelled. So that's theme 1. Let's move on to theme 2. Okay, theme 2 is that actually retirement ages are much more variable than you might think. All right, an awful lot of people have sort of 65 as the date, or in their heads, and maybe they'll go between 60 and 65 if they can last that long, and all those sort of things. But okay, let me just throw you out a few numbers to convince you that actual retirement ages vary an awful lot more. So if you go back to 1970, the retirement age in the European Union, okay, the average retirement age was actually about 68 and a half. Okay, by 2000. That number had come down to 62 and a half. Okay, so in that 30-year period, you had like a 5-year reduction in average retirement ages. And something very surprising that happened in the early noughties, which is retirement ages actually started drifting up again. And these are not legislative retirement ages I'm talking about here. These are actually when you go out and you survey people and you ask in a given year, if you retired, what age were if you retired this year. So this is a very clear measure. So much more flexibility than you would think. And even in the world currently, retirement ages in Europe are about 62 and a half, I said. In the United States, they're about 3 years more than that. Okay, it's about 65 and a half is the average retirement age in the United States. And in Japan, it's over 70. Okay, so we're all human, we're all doing the same thing, all right? But that variation is there. And I think most people don't really understand it. Now, studying retirement is really, really important, because if we can understand more why people retire, we're going to be in a much better position then to try and identify the factors, in a sense, that are nudging people out of the workforce, and back to this team then, are we going to be better able to hold on to people? So this is really, really important. Okay, so one of the reasons that people retire, okay, I mean, apart from just, you know, I've had enough, money matters, okay, financial incentives matter. And bizarrely, across Europe in particular, a lot of our social welfare policies actually, not only do they not provide an incentive for people to remain on longer, very often our social welfare policies almost encourage people to get out of work as quickly as possible. Okay, so we had transition arrangements and everything like that if you became unemployed, all sorts of transitions to get you towards retirement. We had pension policies that, you know, it didn't matter if you kept working and contributing, your benefits were not going to go up in any shape or form. So an awful lot of the sort of pension infrastructure really discouraged people actually from sticking around. There was almost a penalty to stick around. We've done a lot of work over the years across the world in trying to smooth out these sort of things and moving to situations that pensions are actuarially fair, whereby the longer you work, the more you're contributing, that actually is reflected then in your ultimate payoff. The other thing, actually, if you ask people about retirement, very, very often they will say they would have stuck around longer if they could have been given greater flexibility and reduced responsibilities. Okay, we have very, very sort of structured employment trajectories in Ireland in particular, where you tend to move up the hierarchy, and the vast majority of people retire from the highest point that they've reached. Not many people retreat back. Okay, although an awful lot of people would say, I'd like to carry on, just not being the CEO or the vice president or whatever those sorts of things are. So again, flexibility really, really matters. And there's one more thing actually in the decision retire. There's a social norm and peer effects here. Okay, so I'm going to describe this in the following way. We've known for a long time, unemployment is really bad for you. Okay, if you're unemployed, it's bad for your mental health. Okay, but it's not as bad if all your peers are also unemployed. Okay, the biggest impact on you, if you're the only, I always, when I say it's a bit like, remember the Little Britain sketch, the only gay in the village. If you're the only unemployed person in the village, it's miserable on you. Okay, but if the folks around you, it's still bad, but it's not as bad. So some research I did with a colleague using the data from the Irish Longitudinal Study on Aging, we try to get a handle on this notion is that if you're an older worker in an area, does it impact if you're one of the few older workers, okay, or one of many older workers? And we actually in the data did pick up this peer effect. You could see that people were happier if there are sort of the clusters and the peers in their areas, if a lot of people were working. Okay, and again, I think that makes a huge amount of sense. If you're the only one getting up in the morning and you think everybody else is staying in bed of your peers, it probably has an effect. So positive peer effects are possible. Okay, another point on retirement, and I think this is slightly controversial, but we run with it anyway. German economist Axel Borschapane, I think he put this most succinctly. He has this thing about the myths of population aging, and one of the myths he describes is that retirement is bliss. Okay, it's a really interesting point. There's been an awful lot of research. Now, this isn't completely conclusive, okay, but there is no doubt for some people and in some circumstances, retirement is not good for you. All right, and it's not good for some things that you might expect. Things like your cognitive abilities, okay? For the clear evidence in certain cases that if you go earlier compared to other people who stick around, it can have an effect on your cognitive abilities. Depressive symptoms, work I've done myself on this certainly says, you know, sort of enforced retirement can have negative effects on depressive symptoms. But much more broadly, there's a study, a really, really good study in the UK that talks about a lot of the sort of the physical impacts of retirement and early retirement. And the author of this comes up with this incredibly strong statement, all right, having sort of shown that retirement is bad. The person says, delaying the age at which the state pension is paid could be a policy tool for improving public health. All right? So imagine a government coming out and sort of saying, we're raising the pension age to improve all your health. I don't think it would go down terribly well, and I think it's a bit ridiculous, to be perfectly honest, because if you go back to my earlier remark, this should all be about choice, not forcing people. But nevertheless, that sort of strand of research I think is terribly, terribly interesting. Okay, my fifth theme that I'll mention before I do a quick wrap-up. There's often a sort of a strand of thinking out there, and I don't know if it's ageist in its nature, but that when we have this aging workforce, are we going to have productivity declines? Is it the case that older workers are less productive? Okay? And the answer generally is no. That is actually not the case. There's very, very little evidence to show that that is the case. Okay? Some of that is the fact that so many of our jobs now are not physically demanding. Okay, now having said that, it is a harsh reality, okay, for everybody in the audience over the age of 30, your cognitive abilities do start to decrease, okay, in your 30s. Okay, but for most older workers, there's ample opportunity or capacity to sort of trade off. Any reduction in cognition abilities is more than offset by knowledge, skills, and the broader set of experiences that they bring to bear. So there's very little evidence that older workforces are actually less productive. And there is an additional point. The most productive workforces seem to be mixed age workforces. Okay, you don't want a whole load of older people and you don't want a whole load of younger people. You want people working together. And we have similar results in the economic literature, for example, about migrants and the impact that they have. You really want diverse workforces in the modern age. The one little tricky point around that, though, is that where there are significant technological changes in the workplace, that can be problematic for older workers. Okay, because skill obsolescence is a real difficulty. So life is normal in an organization, not so bad, but with significant technological changes, there can be a challenge, and I think we need to be open to that. Okay, so let me wrap along the following ways. I think we do need to retain, I think the figures on this are very, very stark. We do need to be in a situation where we're retaining more workers, and the question is how are we going to do this in a way that's sort of positive? Financial incentives matter. I think flexibility matters as well, but at a much more broader level, I think we increasingly understand that the sort of things that motivate younger people in the workforce, which might be around money, wages, career opportunities, upskilling, all of those sort of things, they may matter a little bit less for older workers, and the key thing for them is engagement. Okay, this is the case for a lot of employees, but very, very much for older folks. They want to feel that they are playing a very positive and valued roles in organizations. I touched on this earlier on. That can be somewhat tricky if you're moving from the very top and sort of moving down. How well respected are you? But nevertheless, I think if we can put a man on the moon, I think we can come up with ways of making workplaces better for older people. So with that, I'll leave it. Thank you.
Alan, thank you very much for that thought-provoking presentation. You've prompted me to ask myself a question I've never asked before. Would it be good or bad to be the only retired person in the village? I still haven't made up my mind about that. Now, our next speaker is David Joyce, and he is Equality and International Development Officer with the Irish Congress of Trade Unions. And his areas of work include the promotion of equality at a number of levels within trade unions and in Irish workplaces, as well as at the national policy level. Please welcome David Joyce. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks to the HSA for the invitation to come and speak today, to Sharon and Gavin and Tom and everybody. I would like to just mark the fact that Congress has had a long-standing working relationship with the HSA. There are lots of outgoing and incoming board members over here to my right. I won't name them all for fear of missing one of them. I've been asked to reflect on OSH performance and changes to employment status for many workers. And as I think fitting into the category that Alan had just talked about, I'm just going to put on my glasses because otherwise I won't be able to see what I've written down here for myself. Let me start by just maybe placing this in a global context a little bit. And just to say, Congress recently was announced as a Sustainable Development Goal champion organization. And so I just want to use this opportunity to put some of what we're talking about in that context. And you might ask, what has health and safety and the future of work got to do with the achievement of Agenda 2030 and the SDGs? And actually, my job is quite easy in that sense today, and a couple of other presenters have alluded to, if not gone into any detail. I saw that William had SDG 8 on some of his slides. But as many of you will be aware, SDG 8, Goal 8, promises to deliver decent work for everybody by the year 2030. And that kind of trips off the tongue quite easily, but it's quite a challenge, as we've heard already from this morning. But globally, I suppose, the view of the trade union movement is that the current economic model has failed working people. The prevailing sort of low-wage, short-term or precarious contracts and often unsafe work environments that dominate supply chains, along with the absence of regulatory environments and social protection that would formalize informal work, cannot stand as a basis for the decent work that SDG 8 stands for. Nor can we accept the rise of platform businesses that use technology to deny all responsibility for employment and other obligations. Such an economy is not only inhumane, but also constitutes both a political and economic risk. And we've seen this. I mean, it drives people towards right-wing extremism, leads to an inequality by design almost, with wealth increasingly being concentrated among the top few percentiles. And hence the campaign, I don't know if you have the slide for me, the time for 8. Hence that slide there on the screen, which is a global trade union campaign, Time for 8, which basically calls for a new social contract for workers with business and government. And in the context of today's discussions, the demands of that campaign include that OSH become recognized as a fundamental right in the ILO system. And Joakim earlier talked about what's happening in the ILO. The workers group approached the centenary conference with the objective of achieving that in the centenary declaration that was agreed back in June. We weren't successful in that regard, as Joakim has also outlined, but the resolution which accompanied the declaration did include proposals for including safe and healthy working conditions in the ILO's framework of fundamental principles and rights at work. And a paper which was presented to the recent October-November governing body set out a roadmap for doing this, and the governing body has approved that. And while that's not quite what we had hoped to achieve, it is progress nonetheless. And I just want to, at this point, recount that our own Department of Business, Enterprise and Innovation, who represent us in the ILO governing body for the first time as a titular member, have played a key role in all of those discussions. Siobhan O'Carroll led for the EU in the negotiations of the EU declaration, and they played a very active role in the recent governing body in coming to the agreements that have recently been made. All of the elements described above, both the challenges and the elements of a new social contract, will of course be different in different national contexts. But it's the responsibility of government, of course, to convene unions and employers in social dialogue to create the new social contract in national contexts. And we have a long tradition of such partnership work here in the field of health and safety since the results of the Commission on Health and Safety back in the 80s. And it's important to recognize the significant progress that has been made in the intervening 30 years. There's now a strong culture of avoiding accidents and ensuring that the procedures and processes are in place to avoid injuries. And it's our strong contention that the model that we have works and is based on the proposition that an effective OSH system is based on workers and employers cooperating together. Such a model recognizes that the buy-in of all of the people in a workplace is important, and an innovative business leader will of course recognize the importance of a collective approach in striving for safer working, as Michael has already alluded to this morning. It's more likely to achieve acceptance and implementation of practices that will ensure a safe workplace where everybody takes their responsibility seriously. There's also evidence to suggest that organised workplaces are safer and that active safety reps, independently chosen by the workforce, working with management, deliver health and safety for all. There's no place for complacency, of course. I mean, over 3 million workplace accidents occur every year in the EU, with almost 70 deaths per week, and 120,000 people die annually from occupational cancers. So it's clear that too many Europeans, and indeed Irish people, still suffer from work-related illnesses and accidents. And changes in work patterns, and William has outlined this very well in his presentation, also bring new risks. There's no doubt that the transformative effect of new technologies, changing demographics, new ways of organizing work, climate change, and the shift towards the green economy are profoundly changing the world of work. And we're very concerned about the negative effects that digitalization can have on OSH and workers, and new forms of work created by digitalization, such as digital labor platforms, could potentially fall outside the scope of OSH regulations, which were designed to protect workers in more standard forms of employment. Perhaps the worst example of digitalization, and one worth mentioning, I think, on the eve of tomorrow, which is Black Friday, I believe. And Margarita mentioned Amazon in her presentation. Amazon, as all of us know, is a huge multinational retail company with record profits at the top of a supply chain, squeezing transport contracts and pressuring the rest of the supply chain to cut corners, including in safety. Research by the GMB trade union in the UK showed that ambulances were called to attend workers in their fulfillment centres, as they call them, several hundred times in the last 3 years. Often workers in such circumstances have no community with colleagues and no collective means to select reps, etc. And again, it's worth stressing the point that others have made that, of course, all workers need to come under the protection of OSH legislation. So these changes are bringing new and fast-evolving challenges for the safety and health of workers, increased worker monitoring, the assumption of 24/7 availability, more frequent job changes, the management of work and workers by algorithms, remote working, etc. They're all also the effect of labour market deregulation, such as subcontracting, bogus self-employment, the interaction of agency work with health and safety. So this new context clearly demands an exploration of what policies are needed to effectively protect workers, including an assessment of the consequences of the definition of workers and employers in legislation, while maintaining the principle of same OSH standards for all workers. I know that the HSA is in the process of developing your new strategic plan, and of course Congress will be an active participant in that. And it's our view that any new strategy will need to, of course, reflect this new reality and provide new solutions such as advanced workplace risk assessments, using the opportunities also offered by digital technologies, and promoting a proactive worker-centred approach in the planning and implementation of digitalization strategies, and a framework to clarify OSH liabilities and responsibilities in relation to new systems and new ways of working. Let me finish by maybe reflecting on the fact that, of course, some of the older, more traditional solutions are also part of the way forward. And again, William mentioned organising platform workers in his presentation. And social dialogue and respect for the rights of workers to join a trade union and to bargain collectively with their employer are key tools in the achievement of decent work for all, to achieve wage growth, a fair distribution of wealth, to ensure that all workers enjoy safe and healthy working conditions. Going back to Amazon for a second, the GMB trade union have been attempting to organise workers with Amazon for many years now, and unsurprisingly have been met with great hostility by management. And during this time, hundreds, if not thousands, of workers have suffered ill health and injuries. The vast majority of workers in Amazon centres are not direct employees, of course. They're temporary workers employed on zero-hour contracts sourced from labour agencies, vulnerable by design, if you like. Such workers don't have any of the necessary protections to air concerns about working conditions or health and safety problems. Innovative solidarity campaigns such as the hashtag Amazon P-gate, I won't go into it, you can look it up, are perhaps illustrative of some of the battles we have ahead. And of course, we're under no illusions as to the difficulty we face in trying to do this. I mean, such a business model has made Jeff Bezos the first $100 billion man. So, you know, it's going to be difficult. University College of London studies have also shown that drivers and couriers working for companies such as Amazon and Uber may be at higher risk of crashing because of the demands of the gig economy. So, in finishing then, of course, it doesn't have to be like this. I mean, I often have conversations with my son at the moment. He's currently doing a master's in retail in the Smurfit Business School. You know, the School of Capitalism, as we call it in the trade union movement. And it, you know, I suppose he's looking at me going, what are you talking about? You know, but, you know, I suppose that the point is that, you know, in a profitable business like that, surely to God, we don't have to have those kind of conditions for workers contributing to the creation of that wealth. So as Sharon said earlier, the future of work does not need to come at the expense of anyone's health and safety. And that's why we're saying that it really is time for 8 and that the clock is ticking for a new social contract. So thank you very much indeed.
David, thank you very much. Thank you. I'd like to just invite all of our speakers from the session back up onto the stage, and we'll also be joined by Dr. Sharon Mcginnis from the Health and Safety Authority. So we have an opportunity to throw it open to the floor. If anyone has any questions they'd like to ask the panelists, put your hand up. We have one, this lady here on this side. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yep.
Bron O'Leary, I'm a member of the ICTU Health and Safety Committee and I'm a union official for the Medical Laboratory Scientists Association. I was very taken with all of the presentations, particularly at my age, as we aid the ageing population. And I understand from Barbara's list of factors that stress people out at work why my members are so stressed when they speak to me, even though most of them are public sector workers with good, secure contracts and protections, but the work intensity, the technological changes. They work in hospitals 24/7, so it's varying attendance patterns, lack of flexibility, they can't work from home, all sorts of things like that. And then I'm going to be quoting to their employers Alan's quote about we need to design workplaces that ageing workers can live in. And I'm just wondering, the just transition piece that we hear about in climate, do we need to extend it to be a just transition for ageing workers and workplace adapting to the workers, because otherwise these people will not be able to sustain the kind of job intensity they're doing now.
Yeah. Alan, do you want to take that?
Yeah, hard to respond to. I mean, I think it almost goes without saying, let's put it like that, that one of the things that I think we're getting better at understanding is that with the world changing, and globalization was the first thing I think that brought this to the fore, that we increasingly sort of worked out that there were transformations that happen that might be sort of good on average, all right? So globalization basically has contributed to more GNP throughout the world, but there are winners and there are losers. Okay, and I think, you know, everybody now understands, I think, very clearly that failure to sort of redistribute the fruits of all of this has led to Trump, has led to Brexit, and has led to a whole range of things. In the context then of the discussion around climate change, I think again there is an increasing understanding that yes, of course we need to adapt to climate change, and there may actually be economic opportunities there, but we have to take account of the fact that there will be losers in that situation. It's very clear if you take, again, the Midlands we're all talking about at the moment, and those industries that will go out. So we need to make sure we look after those people to bring them along. And then just extending that in the context of a population aging, you know, yet another major transformation for our world. You do worry about people being left behind, but I would like to think that the lessons from these earlier episodes are such now that we're at least talking about them, and that we'll make sure even phrases like just transition apply very, very broadly.
Okay, yeah. Thank you very much. I have another question back here, yeah.
Sorry.
Hello, Karina Brassel from the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform. I've just a question for Barbara in terms of the surveys that you were presenting. I'm interested in terms of the gender that you found. I'm wondering, do the surveys identify the primary earner? And if you were looking at the primary earner, would the responses change?
Is that the survey showing the male and female, the differences during the earnings during certain periods in the life cycle? Yeah, on the work-life balance, yeah.
No, the survey does not. The survey does not identify the primary earner. However, the survey will link the working time, the fact whether it's part-time or full-time that the respondent says he or she is working, to the work-life balance, the working time challenges that the person faces. But you have a good point that, of course, the fact that women can reduce and do reduce their working time in this child caring phase very often has to do with the fact that there is another earner in the family who can make up for that loss in income. And that's exactly what we see when we look at working time increasing for men during the child raising years and decreasing for women. Of course, the group of workers suffering most from work-life imbalances and difficulties to combine both is single parents, whether men or women, that find it even more difficult to combine the two, the caring and the paid work.
Okay, thank you very much. We have another question here. Yes, this lady here.
Deirdre MacDonald, and I'm on the ICTO Health and Safety Committee, and I'm the president of the Association of Secondary Teachers of Ireland. First, I would like to thank everybody for their input, both panels, and it was interesting how often mental health and psychosocial risk assessment and psychosocial environmental work came up. Today, I had to make a choice to come to this or to come to the Forum on Teacher Supply. There is a crisis in our sector around people coming into it and staying into it, leaving after 5-10 years and then getting out as soon as possible. So I wonder, we have been trying to get the psychosocial element to be put onto the radar of our paymasters, which is the Department of Education and Skills, but actually I think it's deeper are the people that we need to get on board with the business case for work-life balance and for the psychosocial element. The fact is that I would say within our sector, and I would say I can speak about a lot of other sectors as well, yes, there are policies, but in terms of the complete risk assessment, particularly the psychosocial, that part of the compliance is very, very poorly looked after. So if anybody has any ideas how we can get our department, and deeper in particular, I think need to take this on board. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Anyone come in on that? No, you're okay. Thank you very much. We have this lady here, thanks.
Good afternoon to you. Michelle Quinn from SIP2. I'm also part of the ICTO Health and Safety Committee. First of all, thank you for the insightful contributions today, and I think they typify all of them, the challenges we all face grappling with the changing world of work. It seems to me that there are excellent work being done within the trade union movement, within employer organisations, etc. And it would seem to me, given that we are genuinely in the midst of an industrial revolution, whether we like it or not, it might have a different manifestation, but the challenges are no less complex. I believe we should be pooling our resources in terms of the knowledge we have accumulated, look at collectively the work we're doing, and then generate a plan that will pool our resources so we can tackle the challenges together. I'm particularly taken with Michael's contribution this morning in relation to the need for workers to play an active part in risk assessments and ensuring their work environment is safe. They have a legal obligation under the legislation, as we all know, but I don't think that has become a living reality in every workplace in the land, and I think by pooling our resources we will be able to collectively meet the challenges. Final observation, if I may, is in relation to the legislation itself. Absolutely central that the remit of OSH be expanded to non-workers. It seems to me a no-brainer why we wouldn't seek that collectively. And the other thing is, I think in keeping with Deirdre MacDonald's contribution, we need to refocus on the welfare aspect of OSH. I think that, as a natural consequence of where we are now, would be a very useful tool to refocus and help us all grapple with the very real challenges of an ageing workforce, new entrants, precarity, etc. I think we have the means at our disposal. I don't see why we should operate in a silo mentality. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much for those comments. If you want to get your phones out, we have a Slido question here. It's question 5. And it feeds into Alan's presentation and the issue of an ageing workforce and the challenges, etc. The question is, approximately what percentage of your organisation's workforce is aged 50 or over 50 plus? Is it not 20%? You may not know precisely, but you may have a reasonable idea. Now, the most common bracket seems to be 20 to 40%. 20 to 40%, and then the next is 40 to 60%, which is interesting in light of Alan's comments about the best workforces are those that have those combination of ages. So 49% of you, 48% of you are saying between 20 and 40% of the workforce is over 50, and it's neck and neck. I think some of them seem to be getting older as we go on with this. So it gives you an idea of what the issues are. Thank you very much for that. Alan, just on that point, you made a point about the social and economic challenges of ageing workforces and why that happens. You also made a point about the value of having that mix of age in a workforce. Are there particular companies that have managed to retain higher percentages of older workforces, and have people looked at why and how that is? And does it relate to things like you mentioned about reduced responsibility at a particular time that might suit them better, as well as flexibility? Are they the driving forces that made it happen?
I'll have to give you a sort of quite a specific answer to the question. And where there's evidence that companies have retained, it's actually often market driven rather than driven by legislation. Because what you find is, if you go to, say, Japan is always a great example because of the extent to which their population is aging. And if you go parts of Italy or parts of Germany, that again, the aging population can be different across the regions. And so in some German companies, what they found is that essentially, you're not going to find any younger workers. So they've worked out that in order to basically be sustained, they have to accommodate some older workers. And you see some fascinating, this is sort of assembly line stuff, very, very simple modifications, so that rather than somebody sort of standing for 4 or 5 hours a day, they get to sit and do exactly the same task. Raising conveyor belts, so there's less sort of bending and shifting and all these sort of stuff. So that's a sort of a very, very practical example.
And low cost as well.
At low cost, but it is interesting is that it's market driven, and I suppose this is always, these sort of things come up in events such as this. The extent to which the market may actually deliver some of these sort of stuff, because some employees at least are enlightened, or the extent to which this all has to be driven by regulation. And as ever, there's a balance to be struck there, but I think it is yet another interesting example that sometimes the market delivers.
Just finally, in relation to a question I wanted to ask Sharon, Barbara talked about remote working, and I found it fascinating that there were various new trends emerging in the workforce, and there was a green light for these are good and these are bad, and two that were maybe that she highlighted related to questions around working from home and flexibility of working hours. What is the position regarding employers and remote working and people working from home from a health and safety point of view, whether it be their responsibilities and whether or not they need to be more conscious, more aware and more proactive about that?
I
I suppose, like in all situations, it's another form of work, it's another location. So no more than if they're working in the office, you would do a risk assessment to ensure that their health and safety is protected. And if you are offering the opportunity to remote work to your employees, clearly you have to have risk assessments to address that. So making sure they have the right equipment, they're trained how to use it, etc. And equally, then when the employee is at home, that they're aware of how they operate and deal with that. And indeed, that you keep connected, because the danger, and it struck me, maybe some of your downs and ups, again about, and even back into psychosocial sides, we often talk about control and demands. So therefore, if, the idea that some people might feel, oh, it was very nice of you to let me work at home, therefore I feel obliged to do more. It's that kind of change in mind we have today. If companies are offering it as an option, and it's a hugely viable option, and it's one I don't think we can get away from, it has to be done in the right way, and the right framework, and the right approach through the risk assessment, through the connection, so that people get, both sides of the equation get the benefit of it.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other questions out there? We're getting close. We have one here, this gentleman here, yeah.
Just a general comment on working time. I think with the advanced Neil Linehan, Irish Water. With the advanced technology, working time has become very grey, and this always on concept. So you have the man or woman come home from work, long commute, and Michael touched on it earlier on, and then it's that always on thing where people check emails. Do you think legislation, employers need to do more to control that, because we're giving out free phones, iPads as employers, and we're having a massive effect on people's well-being, and I think it's something that we need to focus on and look at, and I'd welcome your comments on it.
Okay. Barbara, do you want to take that?
That's exactly the reason why remote working and teleworking is ambiguous, because you have to have the discipline to say, this is enough, the working day is over, I switch off now. However, attempts to legislate, and William said Italy, France, Spain and Belgium are the four countries where a right to disconnect exists. It doesn't help if the problem of workload is not addressed. Because if I have a right to disconnect at 6 o'clock in the evening, but I know full well that there is still so much to be done, that is more harmful to my mental health and the stress levels than being able to work another 2 hours.
In relation to that, Barbara, and the right to disconnect as well, is there a difference at the top of an organisation, you senior management, who are supposedly remunerated more in order to be more committed and perhaps spend more time and be available at home and emails? Then you have the workers at the bottom end of the organisation. Is there a middle ground? Is there a low to middle management person who actually really, really gets squeezed in that situation?
I think that's also quite obvious that middle managers are in the worst position, because they do not benefit very often from the additional autonomy, but also the additional pay that the highest level of management would benefit from. At the same time, they have the pressure and the responsibility to manage other people. So this is really where the squeeze is most visible. And it is, interestingly, also one of the reasons why we see so few women in higher management level positions, because in order to get to the highest level, you have to go through the middle level, usually. And that's where the combination of non-work commitments, caring, and work becomes even more difficult without yet reaping the benefits that usually come with higher positions in a company. So that is really one of the issues that we have discovered that keeps women from going on this career path and saying, okay, I climb up this ladder because I know up there on the top that's good. But you have to go through the middle level management position, and that is very, very difficult, even more difficult for achieving work-life balance than in lower positions.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we're out of time. I'm very conscious that lunch may be awaiting, and we also have some closing remarks as well to come shortly. So I want to thank Dr. Sharon Mcginnis, I want to thank David Joyce, Alan Barrett, Barbara Gersten, Berger, and also William Coburn for their presentations and engaging answers to the questions today. Thank you very much. And just before I go finally to the closing remarks, I have one more question for you. It's question 6 on Slido. And the question says, now that you've heard about the issues facing workers and workplaces of the future, which of the following best describes your position? Much more concerned, my organisation has a lot of work to do. About the same, we're reasonably well prepared. And less concerned, we're much better prepared than I thought. So much more concerned is a racing certainty there, way out ahead. So I think that probably reflects the content and the quality of the presentations and the question of raised awareness and how important all of these issues are as an awareness issue. So we're up there on 60, we've got over 60, 58, 60% much more concerned, and about the same, we're reasonably well prepared. And there's only about 2% of you are feeling fairly comfortable at the moment, actually. So 3%. So thank you very much for that. And I'm delighted to welcome, to make some closing remarks to you, Chair of the Health and Safety Authority, Tom Coughlin. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. I think looking at the screen, sorry, it's gone, the Sligo is gone. But looking at the results of the Sligo, I think that today has been a very, very worthwhile exercise. Richard said that some of you may feel more uncomfortable after today, but the objective wasn't really to make you feel more uncomfortable, but it was to inform you, and I think that that has been achieved, judging by the result of the last Sligo. But in any event, good afternoon to you all, and I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to be with us here today. I think that the event has been very timely, and I think it's been very relevant, and I'm glad that you've been able to share it with us. As we've heard, there are many challenges ahead of us all as we adapt to the changing nature of work and workplaces. Most importantly, I think we've heard that as we make that transition, health and safety must be and will be central to how we deal with the transition and to reap the rewards of the future industrialisation and digitalisation, which has been referred to. And that's going to take a significant level of change and flexibility within organisations and within companies. And that's going to be a challenge for us all, including the Health and Safety Authority, and particularly for us, for the Health and Safety Authority, and how we work as a regulator. We are going to have to be adaptable, and we are going to have to adapt as well, not just to the changes in the workplace for you, but in us as a regulator, regulating health and safety and wellness within that changing environment. So the Health and Safety Authority has been doing that for the past 30 years. We have been working to prevent illness, critical accidents, to promote well-being within organisations, within companies for the last 30 years. And I can assure you that the authority will continue to do that in the future. And as we do it, as I say, we will adapt to meeting the challenges that have been identified today by our excellent speakers. Before I finish, I'd just like to leave you with a couple of take-home messages and reflections. And I sometimes find at events like this that you come to the event thinking you know what you're going to say at the end of the event in your closing address. But when you hear the speakers and when you listen and you consider the issues that are raised, what you actually say at the end can be quite different. And I found that today. But just a few messages and a few reflections. Keeping yourself and your employees safe and healthy at work as the workplaces change should be and must be the top of your agenda. The transition to the new workplace, it has to be a just transition, but it also has to be cognizant of health and safety. Putting health and safety at the centre of what we do, it makes economic sense and business sense and also ethical sense. So I think that we need to have that in mind. It's not just the economy, it's not just business, it's not just commerciality, it's also ethical. That is also it's also a value that we must include in our deliberations. Putting in place good health and safety practices as somebody enters the workforce is essential. We have to keep our employees working productively for longer, and to do that we need to change the workplace, not just and make changes not just when they join the workplace, but when in advance of them joining, so that we're prepared and we're ready for the changing and the transition that's going to happen. The point that was made by one of the most recent speakers, Meeting the future challenges that were identified today cannot and should not fall on any one individual agency or organisation or body. Collaboration and cross-sectoral learning will be critical. The Health and Safety Authority is ready and willing to work and to collaborate with all other agencies and bodies to meet these challenges, and we look forward to doing that. We already have quite a lot of advice and guidance available, and if there are gaps in any area that we have advice or information available, please let us know and we'll work with you to try and develop the appropriate advice and supports. Finally, on behalf of the board and the authority, I'd like to thank all the speakers who have given us so much today to consider and discuss, and I think that was very much identified on the last LIGO. So thank you to all our speakers and panellists. To you, the participants, for your contributions and questions. To our colleagues in the Department of Business, Enterprise and Innovation and Future Jobs Ireland for assisting us in organising today's event. And finally, to our MC, Richard Curran, to Carrot Communications, the Aviva staff, and in particular all the staff of the authority who have made today's event happen and run so smoothly. Gora Mila Mahagov Golir.
Tom, thank you very much, and I think you'll agree it has been a very worthwhile exercise, both in informing people, raising awareness, and also highlighting what some of the challenges are. So thank you all very much for coming, and there's lunch back down this end where the coffee was earlier on. Thank you once again. Bye-bye.